Welcome everyone to our Provo Municipal Council work session. Today is Tuesday, October 20th, 2020. It is 1:02 p.m. This meeting will be conducted entirely via electronic means on October 13th, 2020, in accordance with Utah Code 52-4-2074. The Council Chair, George Handley, determined that conducting meetings of the Municipal Council with an anchor location such as the Municipal Council Chamber presents a substantial risk to the health and safety of those who may be present there. These are the facts upon which I, Mr. Handley, made this determination. March 6, 2020, Utah has been in a declared state of emergency due to novel coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19. A disease outbreak which the World Health Organization has characterized as a pandemic. On October 13th, 2020, Governor Herbert stated that declaration would be replaced with a public health emergency order. Utah's coronavirus task force rates Utah County as an area with a high level of coronavirus transmission. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention state that COVID-19 is easily spread from person to person between people who are in close contact with one another. Federal, state, and local authorities have recommended, even required, that individuals limit the size of public gatherings, wear face masks, and follow social distancing guidelines. Provo City has adopted a COVID-19 response ordinance that requires facial covering, social distancing, and limits on public gatherings. Physical distancing measures will be difficult to set up and maintain in the Provo City Municipal Council chamber and other meeting rooms. Additionally, the chair of the governing board of the redevelopment agency of Provo City has determined likewise that its meetings are subject to the same risks and has adopted the same procedures as the municipal council. This meeting will be available to the public for live broadcast and on-demand viewing at youtube.com/Provo City Council. This meeting is being broadcast live on the web on the Provo City Council YouTube channel, where it will also be available for on-demand viewing. I remind participants to mute your microphone when not speaking, so as to minimize the potential for background noises and conversations to be picked up, recorded, and broadcast for all to hear. I'll begin with a roll call and I'll state the names of those present. My name is George Handley, Council Chair. I'm joined by Vice Chair Dave Harding and fellow council members Dave Shipley, Dave Sewell, Bill Fillmore, Shannon Ellsworth, and Travis Hoban. We're joined by Mayor Michelle Kafusi, Chief Administrative Officer Wayne Parker, and Deputy Mayor Isaac Paxman, and Assistant Administrative Officer Dixon Holmes, as well as and Cliff Strachan, our Executive Director, and Brian Jones, our Council Attorney. We're also joined by other staff who are supporting us in this meeting and who will be also presenting here shortly. So we'll begin with an opening prayer offered by Council Member Travis Hoban.
Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful for this opportunity to come together electronically to serve the people of Provo, to make decisions on their behalf, and to just try to do what's right for our city and the people that reside herein. We are grateful for this opportunity to serve. We ask for a blessing on all those who might be struggling with the current economic conditions or with COVID or other challenges that they might have. We ask for a blessing on those and on our great city. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Hoban. Although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those invited by the council may speak or ask questions unless otherwise invited by the chair. Please use the raise hand function to indicate that you would like to speak, and please wait until called upon by the council chair before you speak. We'll begin with item number 1 on the agenda, which is a presentation regarding the 2020 fourth quarter financial report. This will be presented by John Borgett, our Director of Administrative Services, and we have 15 minutes for this item.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I want to just walk you through the fourth quarter report. I don't know, John Magnus, if you have that, you can pull it up on the screen. Share it.
I'm bringing it up now.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. But I want to just mention a couple things. On page 1 of the report, it talks a little bit about how this is an unaudited report. As most of you are aware, we are right now in the middle of our audit. The plan is to come back to the council the first meeting in December to have our auditors share and us share that report with you. And so what's important to realize is that this quarterly report is not audited, and there is always the potential that some numbers could change. We think this is a real good representation, but just wanted to remind you of that. I would also say, as I go through the report, I'm just going to focus on some things that I consider to be significant, but if any of the council members have any question, you're welcome to interrupt as I walk through or wait till the end. If we go to page 2, page 2 is a summary of the general fund revenues and transfers in. And a couple things that I wanted to just bring out here is sales tax revenue. You can see that we were actually up by $825,621, which was pretty amazing considering that we have been in the middle of COVID since March. We were really concerned about the impact that COVID would have on sales tax. But for most entities in the state of Utah, I think because Utah is a well-run state and because we have a diverse economy, we came through pretty darn good. And so we come through 825,000 up. You'll also see that our wrap tax, which is also based on local sales tax, was up as well. And so both showed some positive signs there, and that just gives us additional funding for the recreation, arts, and parks for that, the purpose that's collected. If you look down at charges for services, which is about 2/3 down the line, we are down about 1.4 million. And that primarily comes from Parks and Rec and our rec center that was closed for a period of time and was impacted pretty heavily as COVID hit strong. I would mention though that in the latter parts of the year, we reopened and we started seeing some revenues come back in. And in September, revenues were actually really strong. And now that we're back to where we've got more limitations, it's backing off a little bit. But I think that it was well managed, but we were down in that area, charges for services, and it's not a surprise. I know we've talked to council about this before, and so I wanted to highlight that. Also, if you look down in transfers from energy, we were down about 480,000. That was related to a couple things. Number one, the impact from COVID-19. As businesses were closed, as BYU was closed, as people were concerned about the economy and concerned about their utilities, and with some members not even able to make their utility payments, we have seen a decrease there. Also, it can be weather related. We actually had a really hot summer in July and August. We expect to see revenue strong, but we were down about 480,000, which we had shared with council before. The other thing that I would mention is that this is just the general fund. Some other areas that the general fund subsidizes or provides transfers to that we're also down at Justice Court. We continue to have limited operations at the Justice Court, and our revenue being impacted there. The Covey Center, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is doing everything they can to encourage and to have people come safely to watch events, but still being limited due to the restrictions of COVID. And then our golf course, revenues were down in our golf course as a result of COVID, and also as a result of us constructing the new holes and being limited on being able to offer our full services. But as you know, the golf course has had their grand opening now, and we're expecting good things going forward. If we go to page 3, this just kind of shows graphically, you can see the revenues. And these numbers are big numbers, so you can see that not a lot, but we were down a little bit from the budget, and we were about slightly down from the year before. Transfers in, you can see that we were down from the budget, which primarily was represented by energy that we just talked about. If you go to page 4, this just shows graphically our sales tax revenue, and you can see that we were above the prior year, which is the green number on the left to the blue, and then to the right was our budget. and we were above the budget too. And then down below is the Recreation, Arts, and Parks tax, which actually has a very similar trend. I would mention that this is our second full year that we've had the RAP tax in place. And then as we're now in fiscal 21, we're entering our third year and seeing good positive trends, and we feel good about that. If you go to page 5, the next page, it just shows here community development fees. We're over the budget, but slightly less than last year. I would mention though that this past summer, particularly July and August, September, we've seen kind of a resurgence and had quite a few building permits, and those revenues are up for that first quarter of 2021, and we'll be sharing that when we do that quarterly report. The Parks and Rec fees, this just shows how we were impacted by COVID. And I just want to mention again that I really feel like our Parks and Recreation Department has managed things well, and it was just something that was unforeseen and something that definitely impacted them now, and it continues to impact them due to those restrictions. If you go to franchise fees, which is on the next page, franchise fees primarily, it comes from our local utility providers like our waste haulers, but primarily our own utilities. And because energy was down significantly, and that's part of that franchise fee that comes in, that's another reason why we were down from the budgeted number, up a little bit from the prior year, but down from the budgeted number. Our property tax and vehicle fees came in solid. Property taxes are something that is stable and a good, reliable source of revenue for the city, and so that came in good. I'm going to skip to page 8 because we've already talked about the revenues, and I don't think I can answer questions, but I'm just going to go to page 8. Page 8 are the general fund appropriations, and I just want to mention that in a year with as many needs that we've had and the challenges that we've had with COVID-19, I think that this number, as far as appropriations in the general fund of $209,000, I think it's a very good sign of good management by administration and the city and the council. And there are some items there. If you go back and review them, you should have records, and those will just tie out right with what came to council. But not a lot of general fund budget appropriations this year, and I think that's a positive sign as we look at and realize the impacts that we're having from COVID. Go on to page 9, which is the library. The library did have some impacts related to COVID, but because most of their revenues come from property tax and very little comes from charges for services, that it didn't really impact them very significantly. You can see that they had about a $22,000 projected loss for the year, and their property taxes were actually up, which helped offset some of the other impacts. But they came through strong. Don't see any negative signs there. We go to the golf course, which is the next page. Golf course, we had some pretty significant impacts to revenues just due to construction. The other thing that happened, when we closed and didn't originally open for COVID, we kind of made a mental decision for a period of time to leave the golf course closed so that we could work on construction and get the holes completed and be ready to go. And then they did open it shortly after that, but it's just a challenge when you're dealing with construction and trying to improve the golf course long term. It does have some short-term impacts, and we experienced that at the golf course this year. If you go to page 11, this is our water operating revenues. I would just mention that revenues were up that year. We had a 5% increase, and that's why you're seeing revenues up. Another significant number is if you look down under capital in column 2, you can see that we spent $5.6 million in water infrastructure, and I think that's significant. The primary reason that we have had rate increases is due to addressing important infrastructure needs, and you can see that happened in the water department. Our water utility. If you go to the next page, which is wastewater, Wastewater, you can see that they've already started some work on the treatment plant. We spent 14 million on capital if you look down towards the center in the middle. And so there's some significant infrastructure that's being addressed in wastewater. I would also mention that there was a 15% rate increase, and that's why revenues went up from 14.8 million in the prior year to 16.7 million in this year. Go to the next page. Our energy utility, probably the only thing that I would mention is you can see that revenues were down from 74 million to 72 million. And we already talked about the reasons behind that being primarily being COVID and being just being limited by more businesses than residential as far as impacting the revenues, and particularly BYU and other sources. You go to the airport, which is on page 14. Interestingly, if you look at the operating revenues at the golf course were almost exactly equal to what they were the prior year. And so I think due to the fact that we've continued to have scheduled service there is a positive. If you look down in the non-operating too, you can also see some significant funds that have been coming in. The 10 million, 9 million of that was the money that we got from the state. The 4.9 million below that, that was primarily the 5 million that we got through the UDOT loan. And then there has been some work on infrastructure at the airport of 9.6 million. If you go to sanitation, sanitation operation, our revenues were up about 500,000, and that was a result of a 10% rate increase that happened in fiscal 20. But other than that, there was a positive fund balance and net income of about 900,000. Good operations. Nothing else to report with sanitation. Go to storm drain on page 16. There was an 8% rate increase there. You can see the revenues increased by about $500,000, and they did spend about 1.2 million on capital infrastructure in storm drain. If you go to 17, which is the last page, this is our transportation utility fund. I think this is significant. They actually spend about 3.8 million on street maintenance, and it brought us, there's been in the last couple of years some money that we haven't spent. It's just been in fund balance, but they used it this year, and we're down to an ending fund balance of about 500,000, which is about where I think we want to be. And so they were able to make some significant street improvements or street maintenance work throughout the city, and you may even want to have somebody from our streets division come in, or from our engineering division, just kind of report on what they did, because there was a significant amount of work that was done there. With that, that's our quarterly report. I'm happy to answer any questions, but that just kind of gave you an overview of the report for this quarter.
Thank you, Mr. Borget. We were out of time, but maybe there's some quick questions from the council. All right. Well, we appreciate it very much. I think, as always, we know we're in good hands with you and those who work with you. We appreciate the updates, and we're encouraged by some of the signs.
Thank you.
All right. We'll move on then to item number 2, which is an update from Fire Chief Jim Miguel regarding protective equipment purchased with CARES Act funding, plans for Fire Station 21, and needs for the airport. And we have 30 minutes for this item. Go ahead, Chief. Thanks for joining
Chair
us.
Handley, members of the City Council, good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity and the invitation to come here and talk about kind of the current events, if you will, of the fire department. As I prepared this last week, I did not count on the activity of the weekend, so I want to give you a brief overview of what took place this weekend and what our involvement was. Saturday, just before noon, above the shooting range in Orem, a wildfire started that it doesn't have to burn very long before it's in very difficult terrain, and they were able to control a lot of the west side of it, but the east side of it continued to move. It wasn't long before we got a little wind, and that wind took it around the east corner and started it up the canyon. We initially sent 3 of our wildfire units. We had a chief officer that responded and became the operations chief. We have another captain that responded, and actually they switched roles when they all arrived, but we were in charge of the safety operation, and we were in charge of operations for the early part of the fire. As I said, we had 3 wildfire engines. We actually sent 1 more what we call type 1 engine, a structure fire engine. And our biggest concern became it jumping the river. There were some homes that were down in the flat down there on the west side of the river or the north side of the river, but they had we received 5 engines from Salt Lake County and 5 engines from Utah County that were deployed down in there to protect those homes. Saturday night, we actually, as the fire began to grow, and if you saw it Saturday night, you saw it burning with some unusual vigor this time of year. And fuel moistures are really, really low. Humidity is lower than typical, and there was quite a bit of fuel up there. So as it started to move to the east up the canyon, we did an all personnel recall of the Provo Fire Department, and we staffed everything that we had in fear that if it jumped the river, we were going to have to get on it very quickly, or it was going to spread rapidly on our side of the river and begin to impact Provo residents. We got into the Springdale subdivision, and we were just trying to ensure that if it got across the river, that it wasn't going to get far. So we did that until about close to midnight on Saturday night. The fire continued to burn into Sunday, but continued to look a little bit better. They became concerned that if it got up high and started to move quickly in a stiff wind, that Sundance could be threatened. So there was an advisory evacuation notice sent to the residents of Sundance. That has since, well, I can't say that it's been lifted right now, but the feeling is that it will be lifted shortly if it hasn't been lifted already. The fire is well under control. I know the reports are that they've only got 10 or 20% containment. They're feeling very comfortable about where they are right now in the firefight. They've got a line all the way around it. They're a little hesitant to be really optimistic until they know that they've absolutely got it. They are concerned about a wind event that is supposed to arrive tomorrow. And so all resources are staying on the fire until such time as that wind event comes and goes. And so just better to be safe than sorry. The fire is at about 3,500 acres. Today there are 220 personnel on the fire, and things are feeling very good right now. We have a chief officer that is up in Sundance, assigned to the Sundance division, just getting them ready in the event that something were to happen. But at the briefing this morning, they were feeling pretty good about the progress that they have made. These cool nights, higher humidities and cool nights make a huge difference in their ability to get their arms around the fire. And we've had, I think, unusually light winds, which has been a blessing. Any questions about the range fire? I think it's been pretty well advertised that it was a shooting incident that took place from the Orem range, got the grass burning up above it, and the city of Orem is looking into that as to how that all happened. But that appears to be the point of ignition.
Mr. Fillmore.
Chief, given the cause of this fire in the northeast Orem area, how concerned are you about the shooting range in Provo, the Provo's shooting range south of the river?
Well, they've taken. I can't speak to exactly how this happened, Councilor Fillmore, and I think it'll be. I think as more information comes forward, we'll understand whether it was an accident that could happen or whether something was done that shouldn't have been done. I know that our range is very well kept, but we will be having some additional conversation as we move forward, just so this, we have to learn from this if in fact there's something for us to learn. Probably the bigger issue becomes how well this fire moved this time of year. Most fire departments, most wildland fire departments are beginning to stand down in Utah. And so for the fire activity was a little bit surprising. You've heard me say that we have some significant risk in Provo, especially in the central and northeast ends of Provo. And you've also heard me say that if it is not out of the question that under the right wind conditions and humidity and heat conditions, it is not out of the question that a significant fire could move through our interface. And so we have been talking and we have been ramping this up a little bit every year. We've been doing some additional education. I think this year I and Mayor Kafusi have had conversation about taking the winter to do some identification of where our most serious problems are and preparing to do our public education, take somewhat of a leadership role in risk areas. Some of the property that is poses a little bit of a risk actually belongs to the city of Provo. And so making sure that those things are taken care of, and then actually in our really difficult areas, taking some enforcement action to see to it that people are willing to clean their properties and they're willing to provide defensible space. That fire, we were all surprised at how quickly it moved this late in the year. And we actually anticipated, when we saw that happen, we anticipated that we would have more fires like that up in the mountains based on the fact that this was the big deer hunt, and things happen when you have campfires and guns and all that other stuff. So, but fortunately it looks like we got through this with not a tremendous amount of damage compared to what it could have been. But we will be talking about what it is that we need to do in Provo over the winter and taking some action in the spring. Just on a side note, we participate in the wildland program in the Western United States, and we've been in 5 states this summer. We were in California for what was a record nearly 2 months. We have our billables, if you will, are nearly $600,000 worth of resources that we sent into those states, not just Utah, but we went to Nevada, Oregon, and our significant investment was in California, our contribution was in California. So, and we're not sure California's done yet. We're prepared. We're prepared to go back if we need to. The Santa Ana winds haven't really begun to blow. The typical fire problem that they have in Southern California really hasn't even occurred yet. What you've seen is, from my experience, being in California for a long time, what you've seen is just almost unexplainable. So we're prepared to go back if in fact we are needed. And we do that because we count on the fact that if things get out of control in Utah, we will get those same resources. All of those resources that we're going to help will be deployed into Utah to help us protect the Wasatch Front, to help us protect whatever it is that we need to protect. So it's a good agreement. I think financially it actually we have some revenue from it because the reimbursement rates are much higher than our salary rates, and so then they rent our apparatus, and there's some other ways that we bill more than we spend. So, any other questions about the wildfires? Or
Chief, if I might just follow up quickly, thanks
Sure.
for an excellent report. So do I take it correctly that we can expect, particularly with respect to the northeast area of the city, the foothills, we can expect the report and some recommendations late winter, early spring?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully with some identified areas of what would be our priorities to get cleaned up. And again, a very, very robust public education campaign.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Just one quick thought on that too, is it seems like with the firework restrictions that we have, we're very careful about the foothills. It seems like there's some guiding principles there that would be important here under certain kinds of conditions, environmentally, when you've got that kind of tinder out there in the foothills. Maybe there's some metrics we can look at that would help initiate some sort of restriction on certain activities that would make us vulnerable during certain conditions.
Well, the reality is that our fire marshals shut the mountain to the state, or the National Forest Service and the fire marshal basically shut the mountains down to open burning. And while there has been some evidence of there have been a few, little bit of evidence of open burning that has taken place, we, for the most part, continue to get the kind of compliance we get on fireworks. We have been working a little bit up in Rock Canyon, been working a little bit up in the Provo Canyon area and Squaw Peak area, but we do get an amazing level of compliance compared to many jurisdictions, and we will continue to do that. As a matter of fact, we're redoing some signage in Rock Canyon, and we're working to make sure that when fire rings are built, that they are destroyed, because typically a fire ring just invites the next fire. So if we can get those torn down as soon as possible, they don't send a message that it is in fact allowed.
Thank you. We have more questions, one from Ms. Ellsworth and then Cliff Strack.
Yeah, I'm curious if the city has any tools or mechanisms to prevent illegal camping that might start a fire, or sometimes it's homeless people camping. Is there any reason that it should be of concern, or has that ever caused a fire, or is it not important?
No, I'm sure it has caused a fire. I don't have statistics with me, but I'm sure that we have had some issues with that, and we know that we have some homeless camps that exist throughout the interface. I think that again, we have a very active community who is out, and they're walking and they're riding and they're reporting, and when they report, we are able to go and we're able to take care of those things. It is not legal to set up camp in a place that's not designated for camping. And we have a camping ordinance, and so there's again, I think one of the reasons that we are so successful, and I consider ourselves very successful, but one of the reasons because we have such an active, caring community who pays very close attention to what's happening in their neighborhoods, and they're quick to let us know.
Okay. One of the reasons we're successful is because we have you. Thank you to you and your team.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Strachan.
Thank you. I just wanted to remind that we're still looking for an update on the CARES Act and how the fire department's dealing with airport issues and that. But Chief, it seems every year we hear about fires that start because of shooting. Is there a standard for these firing ranges and that in order to protect that need to be implemented, whether it's just ours or others as well? But it seems like every year from around the state, there is some fires that start from shooting activities.
The vast majority of those are from impromptu firing ranges. People go up to the mountains. The West Mountain is a great example of this. I think the last 3 or 4 times the West Mountain has been set on fire, it's been set on fire by they're shooting exploding targets or doing things that they're just not thinking about the consequences. And for the most part, it's legal to shoot there. However, they did shut all that down. There are many places that you could shoot 3 years ago that you can no longer use as target practice.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Strachan, gave me a great intro into my next subject. I wanted to give you wanted to talk a little bit about the CARES Act, and first thing I want to say is that the fire department and police department, we can speak about the whole city. I can only speak to the fire department and what I know from Chief Ferguson about the ability that we've had to keep COVID out of our operations. We feel like we've been very successful. We've had a few instances where we've had some exposures and we've isolated those. We've taken a very cautious approach. Probably the most significant was in our dispatch center. We had 5 positive tests, and that became a little difficult for staffing, but we were able to work through it. The leadership at the communications center did a phenomenal job. So we've been very effective at being able to manage it as we've responded to it out in the community. Yeah, and they have all come back to work. We have, I think, one person now that has it in his family. He is negative, but he has it in his family, and so he is not with us right now. But that's, I think, the extent of it right now. So we were able to present the mayor's office with some requests for CARES Act funding, and I wanted to speak about a couple things that were granted in the fire department. First of all, every department submitted some requests for protective equipment or sanitizers, something that had to do with COVID. And we felt strongly that what we should do is kind of organize that effort, and rather than every department just kind of storing their masks and doing all that, that we have one central depository and one central distribution, and that is going to be the fire department. Actually, we're going to do that out of our new fire station number 2. So when somebody else in the city needs masks or needs something sanitized, or we will have the equipment to provide that, and in many instances we'll go and we will do that. So we have been spending CARES Act money building our stock, buying our foggers and some of those things. But there were 2 other requests that were granted, one of which has a huge benefit to our community well beyond COVID-19. It is important it is important as we battle this virus that we have it, but beyond that, it is an amazing tool, and we want to show you. I have Captain Sam Armstrong with me, and this is called an auto pulse. The cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or CPR, is one of the most. There's more contact in this than anything that we do as a fire department, and if any of you, I know probably most of you have had a CPR class. Hopefully you haven't had to do it outside of the class, but if you have, you know that it is exhausting. And one of the things that they have found is that most providers, most people who are doing CPR will do it well for 15 or 30 seconds, and then it will start to decrease the quality. And then we switch, and it goes really well for a little while. It decreases the quality. If you can see it, if you think about this from a COVID-19 perspective, as we have to do CPR, you can see that I am in a very difficult place to do that and be exposed by somebody who we may have to work on that is actually positive, that has the virus. And so this equipment has been available to us for several years, and it was funded this year. Every one of our ambulances now has this, and it's called an auto pulse. There are many reasons why this is far more effective in CPR than our just typical even hands-only CPR. One is it's uninterrupted. It provides the same quality CPR from the time we turn on the machine to the time we turn off the machine. That means when we're moving downstairs, when we're moving from a house to an ambulance, we are getting the same quality CPR that we would get if we were in a perfect condition. Second, it frees up a set of hands to do IVs, to do all the other things that we have to do in a full arrest. It frees up another set of hands, so it provides us, if you will, one additional personnel to do that. So But what this is a band. There's a table that we lay the person on. We have the ability to strap them on, and then there's a band that goes around their chest. It is not just the pressing on the sternum, but it is a squeezing of the entire chest, which again increases the quality of the CPR that we do. Again, keeping us out of the exhalation zone where we would be more likely to get exposed to COVID and any other disease for that matter, any other virus for that matter. And then it's just as simple. Okay. You stretch it out, place it right on the chest. Okay. The bands tighten up. I don't know how well you can see that, but you could not do that effective CPR with a human, just a human providing the CPR. So, and again, this as long as it's got a charged battery, it has there's no end in sight. So it's said that save rates could go up as much as 20% in a device like that. If you think about what that means to our community, that is a huge benefit when you or a family member suffers a cardiac arrest. The opportunity maybe to increase your odds by 20 or 30% based on the CPR and quick intervention that's being done by our paramedics. So this was one of the requests that was funded. This was a little over $100,000 for all of the ambulances that we have in Provo, and we think that for the purposes of COVID and the ongoing benefit that this will have to the community, it was a wonderful expenditure for our CARES Act money. Also, the last thing, we have been working for several years to try to get a second set of protective clothing for all of our firefighters, not just for carcinogen protection, but now for virus protection. If we go to a car accident or we somehow are in our protective clothing at an accident, we don't typically wear our turnouts to a medical call. Sometimes if it's at night or if we have just left another call, we could end up doing that. But once those are actually exposed, then we have to wash them in a very particular way. And without another set of turnouts to get into, you are basically having to wait until your shift is over to get out of them, or risk the fact that they're in the washing machine the next time that they will be needed. And so, so for many reasons, and like I said, carcinogen protection for our ability for continuous response, and for the ability to clean them when in fact we get exposed to blood particles or blood, and oftentimes it's not particles. We get significant amounts of blood. If we're at a car accident or something like that, we're getting our turnouts contaminated. And so we were able to, out of this money, we were able to purchase, or are in the process of purchasing, another set of protective equipment for all of our firefighters. These sets, we just got our RFP back, and they are, all of them came in at right around $2,000 per set. So we have $126,000. That'll get us very, very close to what we need to get all of our firefighters an additional set of protective clothing. They also have an expiration date. They just don't last until they're just worn to rags. We have to keep track of when they're purchased, when they're washed, and how long we've had them, because they have an expiration date. And after that expiration date, we cannot put our firefighters in them and send them into a hazardous environment. So again, we're very grateful for the purchase, and our firefighters are very excited about having the second set, and I think it's going to make us much safer and much more productive. Any other comments or questions about the CARES Act? Those were the three things that were funded for the fire department through the CARES Act.
Thank you, Chief. Any questions?
The last thing I'll give you an update on is the master plan. As you're aware, several months ago, we hired a company to come in and to evaluate our city, evaluate our fire protection, our staffing, our station placement, the number of stations, all of that. And we have been busy inundating them with data. In order to make a real strong case for what they're going to recommend, they need data 4 years back, and we have been trying to get them that data in a form that they're able to use. And they're still doing that. We don't anticipate hearing anything from them for probably until the middle of November. Now we hear from them pretty consistently about needing more data, needing something clarified. We're constantly in contact with this company, but the answers that we're hoping to have, we've been asked by you at budget time about fire department staffing. Fire department staffing is far more complex than just how many firefighters we have per thousand. It has to do with how they're distributed and has to do with what we call our effective response force and how many incidents we can handle at any given time. And there's just a lot that goes into it. So we hope to get that answer as to what our current staffing and future staffing should be for the fire department, where exactly Station 1 can and will be located, where Station 6, and we refer to it as Station 6, but that is a fire station that would be in the northwest out by the high school, the new high school, somewhere in that vicinity. And then the relationship between our Station 4, which is at West Center in 2050, the relationship between it and the airport and Station 6, and how we are best going to most effectively and most efficiently serve Southwest Provo and the additional needs that we will have at the airport, given the fact that we are excitedly awaiting additional commercial air traffic that will come in and out of Provo. So they will weigh all of those, and we'll be able to have some dialogue based on the data that we've had and things that we can anticipate. And so we're still waiting on that, but excited that we're going through the study.
Thank you very much, Chief. We very much appreciate you. We were all thinking of you and all those who served with you over the weekend, and mindful of what important work that is. And we know that, there's your job includes both the immediate response to emergency, but also this kind of longer term planning. And we know you do this really well. So we're really appreciative. Please thank everybody who's been working so hard to keep everyone safe. I know we all feel very appreciative.
Thank you very much.
All right, we'll move on then to item number 3, which is a discussion regarding proposed amendments from the Sign Committee to Provo City Code regarding electronic sign hold times and permitted locations. And this will be presented by Hannah Salzel, a policy analyst, and Javin Weaver, planner, and we have 30 minutes for this item.
All right, can everyone hear and see me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this came to the committee, or to the council from the committee in July, I think July 7th. We're just going to run through very briefly some of the logic and principles behind the proposal, which should be familiar, and then some of the updates. The committee has narrowed it down to 2 options with some of the points that they're proposing, and would like the council's feedback. We have spoken with Downtown Provo Incorporated and Quinn Peterson to get their input as well. I'll share that when we get to that point. Once we have the council's input, the next step is for it to go to Open City Hall to get feedback from the community, and then on to another council meeting. So this is not the last time you'll see this. Starting off, quick agenda, we'll go through the goals and rationale. Quickly, hold times, what they are, what the committee is proposing, where those hold times will be applied. We'll look at a map with Javin will be on hand to answer any questions, and then there will be time for questions and feedback. Right. The goal for the committee was really straightforward. They wanted to promote safety for drivers, pedestrians, and cyclists, and all the other people who use our roadways. They wanted to support new and existing businesses, and signage is crucial to businesses' well-being. They also wanted to preserve community aesthetic, which is a reason for sign legislation. It's a justifiable reason. It is worth noting, signs on the highway are regulated by the state. They have an 8-second hold time for their images, so this proposal doesn't apply to highways. Rationale, this is the part that should be pretty familiar to you. Distractions of more than 2 seconds do increase crash risk, and drivers tend to glance more often and for longer durations at signs that change or move or are dynamic in some way, including the digital billboards we've been seeing lately. Seeing that transition especially is very catching for the eye. So we have tried to, as a committee, minimize the number of transitions that a driver will see on a roadway in a given stretch. Business parks often have one sign shared by several businesses. We spoke with a couple different people who run these businesses and the business parks, and it is very difficult for them to manage 20 businesses all sharing one digital sign. So we tried to accommodate that as well with our longer hold times. Signs often play a critical role in businesses in 2 ways. My fingers are cutting out with green screen. In place finding, simply driving past and knowing that that restaurant or business is there, and in advertising. So conclusions, drivers should see as few transitions as possible. As I said, hold times should be long enough so that they don't create distractions, but also short enough that they aren't hurting businesses, and businesses can still advertise and change signs as needed. So those are the fine lines we've been trying to walk as a committee. As I pointed out last time, our current language uses churn a little bit. The industry standard seems to be switching to hold time, but churn is still used. They are opposites. Churn is how frequently the image on the board changes, and the hold time is how long it stays. So they are inherently opposites. If you see that throughout, just know those are the definitions. I'm sorry, it can get confusing. Hold times, the current and proposed. Our current short hold or high churn is 8 seconds, which is sort of the statewide standard, and that's what we found in most cities when we looked at other neighboring cities. We are proposing as a committee that the short hold time be lengthened to 1 minute. The longer hold time used to in Provo Code be 3 times per day. We didn't find anything in neighboring cities that was anywhere near that long. The committee is proposing that that be shortened down to 1 hour for hold time, so signs could change once every hour in long hold areas. And then there are certain areas where digital signs simply wouldn't be permitted. The exception to this is what we were getting at with multi-tenant signs. If the sign is in an SC3 zone and it represents 20 or more tenants, then its hold time could be 15 seconds as it switches to accommodate the many businesses that are using that sign. Currently, the digital signs are prohibited in residential and agricultural zones, which is something the committee came back and cleaned up. It was implied, but not exactly expressed in code. Currently, long hold time, which is our 3 times a day, just a reminder, is permitted everywhere except this list of agricultural and residential zones. The short hold time, which is once every 8 seconds, is in certain zones along 9 designated sections of street. Code simply lists State Street from this intersection to this intersection. The committee drafted some principles that would guide the new map. I'll run through these really quickly, but they're on screen. Predominantly residential zones would still not be permitted to have digital signs, agricultural zones as well. SC3 zones would have the shorter 15-second hold time if they have 20 or more businesses using the sign. Long and short hold time areas are defined by the streets and on both sides of the streets, unless, for example, one side is residential. Gateways to the city would have longer hold times simply to preserve that community aesthetic so that we don't see digital signs changing all the time as we're entering Provo. Predominantly commercial areas would have shorter hold times to accommodate businesses. Mixed use and other areas would also have longer hold times with the 1 hour. Historic downtown area, this is where the committee has the 2 options. And this was sort of the hitch last time. This item was presented to the council. Option 1 is to continue with what is currently in code, where long hold time signs, which used to be 3 times per day, now with the proposal would be once an hour, are permitted downtown. There are not currently any signs like that. The business community downtown has said that they don't want those signs. It doesn't fit with the aesthetic, and the aesthetic to them is more valuable than having digital signage. The second option is to ban digital signs, but allow other internally illuminated signs, which is a minor thing that the committee worked out. You could still have a neon sign, for example. There are quite a few of those downtown, but you couldn't have a digital billboard that would have an image that would change. I'll ask feedback on the rest of that later once you're a little more familiar with the proposal, but just know those are the 2 points where the committee wanted the council's input. The proposed locations for the different hold times based on those principles. Again, prohibited in residential and agricultural zones, long hold gateway mixed use, short hold SC3 zones, and commercial areas with that note about hold times. So this is the short reference. Feel free to ask me to pull this up again if you want to reference this later during the debate or discussion. There's a raised hand. Do we want to address that now or at the end?
Sure, if you can.
Yep,
Go ahead. So,
Yeah, my question is it says that they're prohibited in residential and agricultural zones, but they are permitted in gateways or mixed use areas. What if a gateway is a residential area?
So that is where principle 1 and 2, these sort of go in an order of priority. If it's a residential area, they're simply prohibited, regardless of other characteristics.
Okay. And then where was the one where you talked about both long and short hold times or both sides of the street? So if in a gateway, one side is residential and the other side is somewhat commercial?
Is predominantly commercial or a different zone, because this is forward looking too, right? And then one side of the street, as far as I understand it, feel free to interrupt me on this. Dave Sewell's the chair for this committee, but as far as I understood what the committee presented, one side of the street that is predominantly commercial would be permitted to have a long hold or a short hold time sign here, and the other side they would be prohibited. The committee is currently working on addressing brightness as well. So I understand that there is some spillover between zones.
Okay.
Hannah, if I may, I think partly to address Shannon's question is along a corridor, if we have commercial zones and MDR zones potentially along the area, along a street, would both of those be able to have it? And then the answer would be only the commercial properties would be, the MDR would not, because that would fall in line with the residential properties of not being able to have a electronic sign.
That is a much more succinct way of saying what I was getting at. Thank you, Jeff. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it sort of does. I'm just concerned that it doesn't necessarily protect a predominantly residential corridor if there are pockets of commercial that can still have that.
Yeah, and that's something that we can absolutely address. There are a few questions that could be asked here. We'll carry on and then we'll get to the rest of the questions at the end, just in case anything else raises any concerns. Javin, I'll turn this over to you for the proposed hold time areas. I have the map ready to go on screen. Let me know if you want me to pull that up and cede control of the presentation to you.
Got it, thank you. So the map that you're looking at right now shows the city of Provo with the areas that are kind of the pink color. That's all commercial zones within the city. Now, within our section of code, we say that electronic signs are allowed in various types of zones. All of those zones are shown on screen. Below that in our code, we say specific corridors that you can have electronic signs. Example, University Parkway, State Street, Kruger Boulevard, University Avenue, etc. What you're seeing on the map is the turquoise greenish color is currently where we permit short hold areas. That would be along State Street, South State Street, North State Street, 820 North, Center Street, University Avenue. We are recommending that, so the short hold areas are the 8 seconds as current code states. We are recommending that some of these areas be changed over to either long hold, which is the 1 hour, or short hold. Long hold would be from on North State Street from 1720 North up towards the city boundary line, Center Street from 13th West to 6th West, potentially more. You know, we need to have further discussion on downtown. Lakeview Parkway is currently short hold, we're changing that to long hold. South State Street would be changing from short hold to long hold. Now, to keep in mind, when you go south of about 1860 South, there is the boundary line that follows the corridor of State Street, and you would theoretically have signs only available on the west side of the street because the east side is not within the jurisdiction. The yellow color is what we're recommending for short hold areas, which would be changing every 1 minute. Correct me if I'm wrong, Hannah. And that would be 820 North, Draper Lane, Freedom Boulevard, Cougar Boulevard, part of North State Street. And then the recommended multi-tenant areas would be up at Shop Street Riverwoods and down along South University Avenue and along University Parkway, where we have the Riverwoods Shopping Mall, potentially the Mix and other large shopping areas on University Parkway and East Bay area. Can I add any, does anyone have any questions to this map? Can I add any clarity?
Mr. Hoban has a question.
Well, yeah, thanks, Gavin. I was just going to say the colors here are kind of highlighting the changes. So the orange, yellow, red, and teal. But there are other areas throughout the city that will have, just by default, a long hold area. So if it's not residential, or, you know, if it's not, I guess, residential agricultural, if it hasn't been called out, then by default, it will be a long hold area. We just didn't mark every road because then the map would have been too cumbersome. So what you're seeing here is primarily the changes. Am I correct on that, Javin?
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay.
Ms. Ellsworth?
Yeah, I'm just concerned that there's a 3.6 mile stretch through my district where these kinds of signs are permitted, and especially between 3rd South and 1860 South on South State Street. There's over 1,000 residential units going in right there, and so to me, it doesn't make any sense to promote or continue to allow significant commercial signage. It's increasingly becoming a residential area because over the last 2 years, over 1,000 residential units have been approved. So why do we want signs there? Lit signs.
So we currently allow for signs along there as code is written today, and this would only be applicable to commercial properties. However, we can definitely look and analyze, do we want to maintain this area to have signs? I think one of the committee members drove this corridor and looked at how many signs we actually have that are existing that are of this nature. And I think, Travis, you looked at that?
Yeah. So I will say, Ms. Ellsworth, I think we're making an improvement. I just want to make sure that that's understood, that right now the signs can churn much more often, and we're turning them into basically a long hold area, so they can only churn or change once per hour. So there is an improvement there. That being said, we can definitely discuss if signs should be there at all as a council, for sure. There are quite a few. So along that stretch, as Javin mentioned, I did drive it, and there are quite a few commercial areas mixed in there with kind of residential and commercial. So it seemed like it was kind of consistent with some of the other areas throughout the city where you have that. For example, University, as you're coming up from, the southern part of University up through, you have residential and commercial kind of mixed in.
What part of University? In the north part?
So for example, if you're coming up University, and let's say you're going through BYU, the BYU area, maybe Center Street through 800 North, there's commercial and residential kind of mixed in there. I'm sure it's probably BYU student housing. I don't know. So it is somewhat consistent with some of the other areas where you have that mixture. Again, I'm not saying we shouldn't address it. I'm just stating kind of the rationale coming into this meeting, what the thought process was.
And what's the standard on North University or Canyon? Maybe I'm thinking Canyon Road. No, University up by the Riverwoods.
So currently we do not allow electronic signs at Riverwoods. I know there currently is a sign currently there on the corner. And the message is changing as well at it. So
it seems like University, the north part of University Ave near the Riverwoods, is a lot more like South State Street than the central part of University by campus. Because near campus, there's a lot of businesses, and that's kind of the center of town, right? This is not the center of town. So I think that if this part of northern University Ave by the Riverwoods does not allow electronic signs, neither should the far south part of State Street, where there is significant residential development immediately adjacent to State Street.
with having,
Go ahead, Mr. Weaver, sorry.
thank you. With having signs at our regional shopping center areas, it is really important to have that allowance for the economic development at said locations and centers.
Well, South State Street doesn't have regional shopping, does it?
No, but this would be, the regional shopping area would be turning or changing every 15 seconds versus potentially changing to 1 hour time changes. So,
Well, my point is just that there's less and less commercial availability on South State Street because it's continually being rezoned to residential. And so I think that we should prohibit electronic signs in much of that corridor, like seems to be the case at Northern University Avenue.
but if I may ask, would you see a difference south of 1860 South towards Mountain Vista Park, right? Mountain Vista Business Park, that area being different than north? So between 640 South and 1860 South, those sections very different?
I think that 1860 south of 1860 South is different. It seems to be a much more commercial area. However, there are homes there too, as you well know. That's where the majority of the current homes of the Spring Creek neighborhood are. There's almost no current homes north of 1860 South, but they're just being built right now. So I'm still a little hesitant there. And we don't know what Springville will allow on the other side of the highway. Is that in Springville or is that in the county?
I am not 100% sure on that, but I can get back to you.
Okay.
I believe it is Springville. I can go through my notes and find out what they permit. Theirs is all fairly citywide. I'll get back to you in just a minute.
Okay.
Mr. Sewell.
If I may jump in with a clarification and a correction, we currently do allow digital signs all along North University Avenue. It's a long hold time area, and I agree that South State Street is very similar to sections of that. There's sections of North University that have residential all along one side and commercial on the other side. And we did notice that kind of discrepancy. And that's one of the reasons that the committee is recommending that the short hold time areas on South State Street be changed to long hold time areas so that they would be treated similarly to other mixed use areas in other parts of the city, such as North University Avenue. The other comment I wanted to make was that wherever possible, we're trying to regulate based on external effects rather than internal characteristics. So as much as possible, we're trying to regulate based on brightness, hold times, size, rather than what happens to be inside the sign. Because in theory, you could have an internally illuminated sign that doesn't change, that would be indistinguishable from a digital sign if the digital sign wasn't changing. So that was how we were hoping to approach it, and we're a little wary of banning digital signs completely for a business. We did put that in as an option for downtown because of, you know, sort of the historic characteristics, but there is some concern, a little bit of concern anyway, as to legal defensibility if we were to try to ban digital signs in other areas that have businesses.
Mr. Harding?
Thank you. So to address Shannon's concern, or to talk about it, my understanding of that hierarchy of how these things apply, that the very top one, number one, was areas that are predominantly residential are not allowed to have signs. And so even later on, down further, it has the part where named roads, you know, have these things. But since the number one on that was residential, my understanding is anywhere along State Street that is predominantly residential would not allow signs there.
Correct. So if it's an MDR zone, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
If it's an MDR zone, if it's an R1 zone example, they would not be permitted to have a electronic sign. If it is zoned SC2, general commercial, anything that is one of our commercial zones and along that corridor that we have codified, then they would be allowed to have a digital sign.
Okay.
Whether they opt to do that, then that's up to them.
So can we go, Hannah, can we bring up that slide that talks about how these this would be applied? Yeah, sorry, yeah, that you were just on it for a second.
Yeah, this is just a distillation of these principles, essentially. So.
Okay, in the text, the documents that we were sent, it explained that these are the principles, and these kind of what the first one that applies is what prevails, I guess. You know, and if that's changed, you know, that's fine. But when I read it, how I understood it is predominantly residential. I guess it does say zones, not areas. It does say zones, so predominantly residential zones. So I assume that would include the LDR, MDR, HDR, or all those zones. But I guess, yeah. So if there is a commercially zoned and commercially operated business on South State, even if it's surrounded by residential zones and residential uses, they still could have the sign. Okay, that answers my question on that. And then the other question I had is just when Mr. Sewell was just talking, he said that North University, we do allow long hold times. I didn't see that in the map we were looking at. So I was curious if I'm misunderstanding the map or misunderstanding what. Yeah, so North University doesn't have a ribbon of color on it.
In the code, it didn't have that area listed as an area for electronic signs. But I know we do have a few signs along North University.
Mr. Chair, may I clarify?
Yeah, go ahead. And then Mr. Hoban has his hand up. Go ahead.
So because of we list the short hold time areas specifically in code, and anything that is not listed as a short hold time area and is not a residential zone is a long hold time area. And so all we were trying to highlight here is what had changed. So any area that isn't shown on here as a short hold time area and isn't in a residential zone would be a long hold time area. And we just didn't put it on there because there's so many of them, and most of them, there was no change. We're just trying to make it less confusing.
Mr. Hoban?
Yeah, I was going to answer that, but also I wanted to ask, how much more time do we have for this topic?
3 minutes.
Okay, so I think if we could table maybe discussions of particular streets or roads, and I understand that it's important to put this all in context, but I think we were hoping to kind of come out of this with an idea. Do we like once per hour and once per minute? Do we want to approach downtown with more of a, hey, let's not have any digital signs downtown, or we want to allow them and we'll regulate other aspects of them? I think that would be, it's probably too short of a time for us to get some guidance on that. So I don't know, Chair Sewell, for this committee, how you want to approach this, but I was kind of hoping we could come out of this discussion, maybe not focusing on specific roads, but on those kind of bigger picture questions.
I think I'll just sort of echo what Travis is saying here and maybe encourage us to get to those issues. Mr. Jones has his hand up. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Just really briefly, just a couple comments. Hannah, if you go back up to that other slide, I wanted to correct one thing. Well, or maybe invite a correction from Mr. Sewell, but Councillor Harding made a reference to this point number 1 about assuming that included the LDR, MDR. I'm not sure that that's the case, because I interpreted this during the committee meetings to simply be a reflection of what is already in city code that says that on-premises electronic display signs are prohibited in the A, RA, RC, R1 through R5 zones. And the next slide number 6 talks about mixed use. I guess MDR isn't mixed use. Anyway, I don't think we currently don't have LDR, MDR, and HDR as prohibited zones in the code. So the committee may need to clarify whether that was the intent of that portion. And then there may also be something that needs to be clarified about the comments that were made about North University Avenue, because although we did put into the code a provision that says low churn electronic display signs are permitted other than in those zones, the trying to scroll down to it to see what it's called, the North University Avenue River Bottoms Design Corridor still contains a prohibition on signs that are not specifically authorized by that corridor. So there's maybe a couple things the committee needs to address as we handle the rest of this.
Mr. Harding, and everybody be aware of the time.
Okay, I'll just rattle through this really quick. One thing that I'm concerned about is, in the past we've talked about a business doesn't necessarily have just one sign. And my understanding from, at the time, community development, what they said was that they kind of have a surface area for the different businesses, and they can have multiple smaller signs, or they can have one big sign, and that's how they handle the backlit signs for that. And so my just for the committee, I'd ask if you would consider what happens if someone decides to go with smaller signs, and now if they're changing every minute, you've got 3 different ones changing. So like every 20 seconds, you've got something that's changing. Just how you want to handle that. I just ask, when we're considering this, just remember not everyone experiences our community from behind the wheel of a car. A lot of what we've talked about is safety of vehicles and impact. How many times does a driver see it change? But we may have people out walking on the sidewalk. We may have people out sitting on the grass or something. So I just ask that we keep that in mind as well. And then finally, there's some discussion about how do we address multi-tenant locations and whatnot. And there's kind of this some logic, some rationale behind that. Well, if you've got 20 places, it's really, if you have 20 small signs, that doesn't communicate very well. But if you give everyone a chance to be on the big board, then everyone can see it. But we're also saying that we want drivers to see minimal changes, no more than one change. And so if they are only seeing one, maximum two of these signs, then 18 of these tenants never get seen. And they may see it on different days or whatever, but from that argument, then just change it once a day. And then, so I have some difficulty with the rationale. It seems like there's some holes in some of the rationale behind, if we want people to see multiple tenants, changing it more often. I don't see how that makes sense. So those are my three thoughts. I really appreciate the committee and your work. You've obviously put a lot of thought into this, and I appreciate it. I am nervous that the biggest thing that the shift does is just catches people's eyes. It catches their attention. I think that's why it's more productive and it's more potent of a sign because of that change more than anything else. But then I just ask, if we're worried about the aesthetics of our community, do we want to be in a place where signs are constantly trying to grab our attention? So thank you.
Ms. Ellsworth, and then Mr. Poole. Then I'd like to comment.
Well, part of the irony is that Mr. Harding's background keeps changing and it's distracting me, but I agree with Mr. Harding because I feel like some of the emphasis of this has been around drivers, and there's certainly people who do experience our community and these signs and these businesses from a pedestrian or as a cyclist or a bike rider. So I hope that will be taken into consideration as the committee moves forward. I generally feel fine about the 1 hour. I think that's a good long hold time. 1 minute seems still too short to me, but I can stomach it. And I think we need to distinguish between a residential zone and a residential area. Because if you're saying no digital signs in a residential area, then I would have some reasonable assumption to believe that if there's a commercial business next to many residential zones, it would be in a residential area, and a lit sign or a digital sign, churning sign would not be permitted there. So I think that kind of clarity would be helpful to understand, is this a commercial corridor, a residential corridor, a commercial area, a residential area, or is it specific per zone, which gets down to the parcel. So that would be helpful to me to have that kind of nuance in our next discussion.
Mr. Sewell.
Well, it sounds like we've got plenty of feedback to work with. Let me just make a couple of brief comments. The current intent was to leave the code the way it is with respect to digital signs being banned in a listed set of residential zones, not areas. And I'd actually forgotten, or maybe hadn't even remembered that the LDR and MDR weren't in that list. So that's something we'll want to talk about. I'm not sure where the idea that digital signs aren't allowed on parts of North University Avenue came from, except for the residential zone. So that's something we'll have to go back and discuss with the committee. We currently weren't proposing any changes in the number of signs allowed on a business, which I think is very limited, but that is something that we should go back and look at because we haven't really talked about that. That was a good point. So far, we haven't heard any negative feedback from counselors about the 1 hour versus 1 minute. If you do have some feedback on that, we'd appreciate hearing it. And then I guess we'll have to punt on the downtown question because that'll take some time, and we'll bring that back to you. And then as far as drivers, we are trying to be cognizant of pedestrians and cyclists. And that's one reason why in the long hold time areas that we're proposing what, by comparison to a lot of other cities, is a very long hold time, the 1 hour, because we do want people to be able to stroll down the street and not be distracted in the same way that we don't want drivers to be distracted in the commercial areas.
Mr. Sewell, I'll just add my 2 cents. I think I can make peace with the 1 minute and the once an hour frames. I think those are probably adequate. I mean, I really care a great deal about the aesthetics of a community that doesn't overdo this, and so I am quite attracted to the idea of, if the downtown area is interested and willing, I think something that really reduces digital signage downtown is appealing. I think that makes it better for drivers and for pedestrians both, right? Where we have actually quite a lot of problems there with pedestrians and drivers not seeing each other. So I think anything that reduces the distraction and improves the aesthetics there is a positive, as I see it. We're Mr. Fillmore, if we'll make this the last comment and then we need to move on.
5 seconds. I totally endorse the committee's recommendations. Greatly appreciate all the time they've put in. Mr. Sewell's done a remarkable job. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Fillmore, and thank you to the committee as well. I'll just second that. Thank you, and we'll be, I'm sure, returning to this conversation within short order. So we appreciate the progress that's been made on this very complicated issue. So we have a 10-minute break now. It is 2:28 to be exact. So if we can just be back I'm going to probably start just shortly after 2:35. So maybe 2:30, 2:37. How's that? 9-minute break, if not, to be precise, and then we'll continue from there. So thank you. All right, welcome back from our break. We will return to our council agenda. Item number 5, which is a discussion regarding a council policy intent statement for Center Street. This will be presented by Councilors Dave Harding and Shannon Ellsworth. So I don't know who wants to lead out, but I'll leave it up to you.
Well, Shannon, I see you're still muted, so let me just jump in and say Center Street currently is designated as a pedestrian mall. And I think right now with the construction on State Street, it's worse than it would normally be. But if you walk out onto Center Street, walk up and down, I don't think anyone would, of their own volition, call that a pedestrian mall. I don't think it looks like a pedestrian mall. I don't think it functions like a pedestrian mall. It doesn't feel like a pedestrian mall. And so the question kind of over the years, because it's been designated as a pedestrian mall for many years, is, do we really want it to be a pedestrian mall? Do we want it to function more like a pedestrian mall? And so Ms. Ellsworth and I met with various people in the administration. We talked about it. It's a discussion that's been had many times over the decades. And one thing coming out of that, we kind of asked the question, what's going to be different about the discussion this time? How are we going to do this differently than previous times to maybe actually make a difference, make a change? And one thing they asked for is a statement from the entirety of the council so that they have clearer direction from the council. And I should note, I believe everyone has received a copy of the statement that Downtown Provo Inc. Issued early last year, calling for some changes to affect how this is, how we treat Center Street. And so Ms. Ellsworth and I worked on a draft Center Street policy intent statement, which has been circulated as well. And I think what we are looking for at the end of this would be, we would ask the council in this meeting to approve this as a policy intent statement. This is not a final action on anything. This is not a commitment on anything. This is just indicating our support and our intention to enact legislation that aligns with this vision. And so that it gives the administration some direction and some confidence that they can work on proposals, and that this is the direction that the council would like to see us move forward.
All right, thank you. Any further introductory comments, or you just want?
No, I'm just hoping that the council got the chance to read it. It's a pretty brief document, but like Dave said, it's pretty high level.
Well, I'll just, I'll start out by saying that, this is something I've always wanted to see promoted more for downtown and for Center Street in particular. That is to make it a destination, not a thoroughfare, to make it more pedestrian friendly. And I think the reasons are in part, for me, driven by safety, but also for business. I think from what I understand, pedestrian oriented business areas are much better. There's a sort of slower pace that allows for people to interact with businesses more frequently. I'm even sorry that we haven't seen, of course, now the weather's changing, but I have seen in other cities that I've had the opportunity to visit during the pandemic, some rather creative ways of using street space for restaurants. We've done some of this, and I just feel like we're kind of slowly inching toward it, but I think more public interface on the sidewalks and in the street with art and music and food can make downtown a really vibrant, continue to make it more vibrant than it already is, and safer at the same time, and more economically alive. So I encourage this very much. I like it. Mr. Shipley?
Yeah, just add that the last at least 2 or 3 TMAC meetings that I've been a part of as liaison to the council with the Transportation and Mobility Committee, they've referred to this. Most recently, it seems like they're very highly supportive of this, and they feel like, and I shouldn't speak for them, but I think I'm hearing from them that they're getting a little bit of pushback from our own engineering department on how to accomplish anything that they would like to see happen. And so I think this is an important start of a conversation, and then, practical ways to divert traffic, for example, from Center Street is kind of a next step that, has costs associated with it and has logistical issues associated with it that will need to be addressed. But I think they're anxious to address it. They just have felt like there's not really a direction to go. And at least historically, maybe that our engineering department has been pushing back a little bit on this, as they know it's there. They know it's, that we want this to be a pedestrian mall, but they're struggling with how to move forward from a budget standpoint, how to accomplish some of the stuff that we're asking for.
Mr. Harding?
I do want to respond to that, but since I took the lead, I'd love to yield to Ms. Ellsworth.
Go ahead.
I appreciate what Mr. Shipley just said. In creating this document, it was truly supposed to be aspirational and simply a vision statement, right? And then my hope is that we can get some really good feedback from TMAC and from the Planning Commission, where they can give us their best solutions, right? Their best recommendations, and then it comes from them. And my sincere hope is that our own Public Works Department doesn't accidentally undermine those best efforts, and that they are part of the solution, and that they help us resolve some of these safety concerns and help us create this aspirational space that is ideal for pedestrians. So like you, Mr. Shipley, I've heard that it doesn't always feel like we're creating a supportive environment for pedestrians, and that perhaps there is a lot of pushback from Public Works, and it's not up for the council to administer within Public Works. But my hope is that they are part of the solution, and that they empower and facilitate the solutions that the TMAC and the Planning Commission bring to this.
Mr. Hoban?
This might be a question for someone else, but I guess in general, if you route traffic away from downtown, or let's say around downtown, you could view it as routing traffic away from downtown. So I get the idea of trying to create a space that's appealing to pedestrians, and I love downtown Provo because of that, because it does have more of that feel than like an Orem Center Street or something like that, right? But is there not potential downside in routing traffic away or around, in that a lot of times the way you look at the commercial space is how many people are driving by that space every day. And the more people that drive by, the more it's worth, because obviously that leads to more sales in the end. So do we have any concerns with, maybe long-term creating this pedestrian-friendly space, but it's bypassed by most people that are driving and shopping? I don't know. Is that a concern at all? I know that's a big picture question, but would love to hear some thoughts.
Mr. Harding?
If I may, I think kind of my response to Mr. Shipley dovetails nicely into my response to Mr. Hoban. So if I may, I have full confidence in our Public Works Department. I think that there are times where they struggle to meet competing demands that are in stark contrast and conflict with each other. And then I think you'll hear different people throughout the community who will maybe not be happy with the balance that they struck, but I have no question that they're doing the best that they can with the direction that they're being given, and that direction sometimes conflicts. So I think one of the reasons why having this statement will be helpful is it helps to clarify the differing directions, and they've asked, we hear from the business community this, we hear from different people, different things, and so I think now that we have a statement from DPI, which is made up of the businesses, many of them along Center Street. Now that if we can get this intended statement, hopefully we're aligning all of this together, so it makes it very easy for them to make some potentially difficult decisions. And I think that's what Mr. Hoban is addressing here. What is good for one business on Center Street may not be good for every business on Center Street. What might be good for 80% might be really difficult change for the other maybe 10% might have negative impacts on that. And so it helps if we can get all of this kind of very clear So I think there are a number of, particularly now with the construction that's going on, we have a high number of people that drive through Center Street, not to stop at Center Street, but just to get to where they're going. Maybe they live or they work on the other side, but that's currently the most convenient way to get there. Right now, what we're talking is not routing around downtown. It's routing onto First North, which is obviously one block off of Center. And the idea is if we can get traffic to flow nice and smooth there, it makes it convenient for people, even if they're going to Center Street, to get to mostly where they're going on First North, and then just drop down onto Center Street for to actually get to the restaurant or where they're going. I do think that we have a wonderful Center Street that already attracts people. It is already a destination. It just is also a thoroughfare at the same time. I don't think we're going to lose that being a destination. If anything, I think these changes will make it even more of a desirable place to hang out. I can't tell you how many times we've said, well, let's go grab something to eat, and we'll just drive Center Street until we find a place that looks good at the time. And I think you'll get that even more so when people, they don't know which restaurant they want to go to, but they know they want to be downtown, they want to be on Center Street, and they'll just park there, and then they can pick from the assortment. So there will be some downside to not having as many people go by, but I think the net will be far beneficial. And then with that, and if we can scroll down, show the lower part, part of this is also talking about timing and implementation. Sometimes I think the implementation has been held off because people say, well, it's going to be $1 million a block to redo Center Street. And that scares a lot of people in that type of construction. So we wanted to make clear that this is a vision for far out. I mean, it might be 5-10 years before we really realize this vision. So what we're calling for is just a stepwise. Every time there's a project, let's make sure that the decisions we're making are getting us closer to that end vision. We explicitly say in bullet 2 that this should not be overhauled in one large project. But with that said, it doesn't mean that, well, let's not do anything until there's a project on the horizon. There may be some small targeted proactive projects that we can do now or in the near future that will have the biggest impact on pedestrian safety, or the biggest impact on changing the feel and really kind of getting us there with just some small investments. And I think you see that in both the DPI statement from a year ago, as well as the one that they just partnered with Bike Walk Provo. They also call for some of these small investments to make, hopefully, the kind of the low-hanging fruit to really make the biggest impact. So they're calling for that as well. I believe everyone has seen that as well. So hopefully, hopefully we can get there. We can be taking these small steps towards getting to where we want to be. And hopefully that's also helpful to the businesses to not have, one large impact. We're not going to take Center Street and close it down for 18 months. We're just going to be making these small improvements as we go along.
Okay, we're almost out of time, Mr. Sewell.
I appreciate the vision and the goals here, and very supportive. Just with one, I guess I'll call it a hesitation, is that I don't understand the cost or the practicality of the idea of routing traffic down First North, what that would take and so forth. If it can be done reasonably cost effectively over some period of time, I think that would be great. But I do have that question.
All right. Well, thank you to both of you. Oh, Mr. Harding, go ahead.
I'll just respond really quickly on that. That is already in the plans. That has already been what they've been working on for quite a while. The question has just been how aggressively should they try to divert that traffic. And really the plan has been to just try to make it as easy as possible to go along First North rather than, trying to penalize people for taking Center. I think there's been some people haven't been happy with how soft that's been, and maybe we need to push a little bit harder to make it even more just default to go to First North. But that's already in the plans.
All right. Well, thank you to both of you for that work, and we look forward to further iterations of where we go from here.
So Mr. Hanley, if I may, I'd actually, and if necessary, I'll make the motion. I'd like to move that the council adopt this policy intent statement. Because of TMAC, I don't remember if they're meeting this week or next week, or at their next week meeting, they're going to be working on this. And we were asked, if we could get a statement together before that would help give them direction. So unless there's objection, I move that we approve this Center Street policy intent statement.
Is there a second? Thanks for that clarification. I'll second. Is there a discussion on the motion? All right, we'll call, sorry, Mr. Hoban.
Well, just real quick, did we have any feedback from the administration on this? If I missed that, I apologize. Maybe that was already discussed. I mean, have they read it? Do they like it?
Mr. Parker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In response to Councilmember Hoban's question, we've not seen the document until today. But again, I think in principle, we certainly don't have any objection. I think Councilmember Harding suggested, rightly so, that we've been looking for some more comprehensive guidance. Our intent is to send your statement, if approved, to TMAC, along with what's rapidly becoming a joint statement between Bike Walk Provo and Downtown Provo Incorporated in terms of things they'd like to see happen on Center Street. And then, as Councilmember Ellsworth suggested, coming from TMAC to Planning Commission, and then potentially either coming back to council with some revisions or finding its way simply into the general plan as we're beginning that process now. We'll be talking I think next week on at the transportation retreat on kind of the process of the general plan and how transportation priorities will fit into that. And I sort of see that dovetailing at that point. So I think that's what we know. We had a great meeting with Councilmember Harding and Councilmember Ellsworth, and so we're supportive of the effort moving forward and recognize there may still be some feedback from other entities along the way.
Thank you.
All right, any further discussion? If not, I'll call for a vote on the motion, and I'll begin with myself. I'll vote yes. Mr. Harding?
Yes.
Ms. Ellsworth?
Yes.
Mr. Fillmore?
Yes.
Mr. Cohen,
Yes.
Mr. Sewell,
Yes.
and Mr. Shipley.
Yes.
Okay, the voting is unanimous. Thank you. We'll move on to item number 6, which is a presentation regarding the Central Corridor Transit Studies findings. We have 15 minutes for this item, and this is going to be presented by Mary De La Mare Schaefer from UTA Regional General Manager and Claire Woodman, Senior Planner. Thank you for being with us.
Delighted to be with you all. I think many of you know I'm the Regional General Manager for UTA in Utah County and former Provo City employee. I worked for Provo City from 1998 to 2007, so Provo's always near and dear to my heart. Not to speak of the years in the 70s and early 80s that I spent at school living in Provo. So I love Provo City. I have with me today Claire Woodman from Parametrics, working with Horrocks on the Central Corridor Transit Study. Just as a brief introduction, the Central Corridor Transit Study is looking at our 850 bus that travels north and south along State Street from Provo Frontrunner to Lehigh Frontrunner. And this came on the heels of the great success of the UVX system, where the cities from Provo to Lehigh were very enthusiastic about wanting to move transit forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Claire, and then I'm available to answer any questions or take any of your comments about this project or anything about transit in general. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mary. Appreciate the introduction, and thanks, Mayor and Council, for having us here today. It's great to be back and give you all an update on where we have been during this study. So I'm trying to figure out how I can control screens here. There we go. Just a really high-level overview of the purpose of this study. You know, our big picture goal and marching order was to really look at providing a robust, high-capacity transit corridor from Lehigh to Provo. It's a pretty long corridor. There's improvements anticipated in MAG's RTP, and so we really wanted to evaluate different alignments and different mode options that could really meet the needs of all the communities along this corridor, and also the regional transportation needs as well. A real big driving tenet of this project really has been kind of the framing up of this really collaborative and transparent process with all of the agencies and all of the stakeholders along this corridor. And so this involved 7 cities: Lehigh, American Fork, Pleasant Grove, Linden, Orem, Vineyard, and Provo. And so it's been a wonderful collaborative effort, and we're really appreciative of all of the time and energy that Provo staff has dedicated to this process, as well as we have moved forward. We started this process a little over a year ago last fall. We kicked it off. We've evaluated a series of transit alternatives, both alignments and modes, over the last year. And we're here today to talk to you all about a preferred alternative that both the Technical Advisory Committee and the executive team is proposing to move forward into future phases of project development. So our preferred alternative is a fairly long corridor. It's about 25 miles long. It's serving about 30 stations between Lehigh and Provo. BRT, or Bus Rapid Transit, is our selected mode. So very similar to how UVX would operate. Very similar transit technology as UVX. In the northern part of the segment, from Lehigh down into American Fork, the plan is to utilize UTA's right-of-way. They currently have a freight corridor there that we're planning on running the Bus Rapid Transit system in. When we get into American Fork, we're going to jump out into State Street, go down State Street, then along North County Boulevard through Pleasant Grove into Linden, and then hop back onto State Street all the way down through Orem into Provo and terminating at the Provo Frontrunner station. I also wanted to point out that this project does include a branch that goes to Vineyard, recognizing kind of the key development that is shaping out in the Vineyard Town Center area. Providing transit to that community was really important to a lot of our partners, so we are including a branch to Vineyard as part of our proposed project. This does help our ridership. It kind of helps serve all of the communities in the study area and really kind of maximizes the project for the best success at serving the transit needs along this corridor. Just some key features we wanted to highlight about this preferred alternative. So it is really creating this high capacity transit spine, this critical north-south transit investment that would serve both local and regional trips. One of the questions we get a lot is, well, we already have Front Runner, and Front Runner, serves the region really well. But Front Runner, the station spacing is fairly long, so you have to go about 5 miles between stations. So this transit spine would really work in complement to Front Runner, and so it would serve both local and regional trips. Our stop spacing is about a little less than a mile, and so we are able to serve people going to more destinations along that north-south corridor. Really, when we were drawing this alignment and picking station locations, we really wanted to serve the key TOD areas and all of the cities up and down the alignment. So we've worked really hard to connect to those major TOD opportunities. And we also recognize that connecting into the regional transit infrastructure that we have today is really important. So we're proposing connections to Front Runner and connections to UVX, as well as connection to the Point of the Mountain Transit study, which will connect transit up into the southern part of Salt Lake County. And we've really taken the time to optimize this alignment to make sure that we're really maximizing ridership and making this project as successful as possible for UTA and all the jurisdictions along the alignment. Jumping into kind of Provo in a little bit more detail here. So the alignment through Provo is on State Street, running down south where it becomes 500 West. Then we hang east on 300 South and then connect into University Avenue where it would align or interline with UVX and run down to the Provo Front Runner station. We have been working with staff and have talked about a few different design options that are possible. And these could be things that are considered as the project moves into the environmental phase, which will start next year. And some of those options included looking at using 100 North as a connection to University Avenue, looking at the concept of a transit couplet that would use both 300 South and 100 North, and also just the option of staying on 500 West all the way to about 9th South and then heading east and accessing the Front Runner that way as well. And so all of those options kind of have their own set of trade-offs, and so those will continue to be analyzed as we move forward. And just wanted to note that we appreciate kind of the creativity and collaboration and moving these forward. I have the stations listed out here, and once again, these will be refined further as we move into environmental. But right now we have stations at 1720 North, 916 North, so near the hospital, 500 North, near Center Street, 300 South and Freedom, along University Avenue, and 400 South. That's where it would interface with UVX, and Provo Front Runner Station. So that's kind of a high level look at our preferred alternative and how it will interface in Provo. I have a few slides that look at the cross section of kind of how this transit investment would lay out in the roadway network, but wanted to take a quick break and see if anyone had any questions about anything I've covered so far.
I just had a quick question. Maybe this is relevant to another discussion another time, but there's certainly increasing flow issues related to University Avenue up to 800 North in Orem. And so I'm just wondering if there's a contemplation of, with the Qualtrics campus expanding up there. I just have increasing concerns about the viability of larger population areas up there that don't have access or easy as convenient access to mass transit as this contemplates here.
So council members, your question about how do we get people from Qualtrics around Riverwoods and move them around on transit?
Yeah, I'm just worried about the congestion that's already a problem there at that intersection and is likely to get worse. And if this would have any connector or some sort of way of mitigating that at all.
We do have a bus route currently that goes to Riverwoods and also connects at Center Street in Orem. our 5-year plan calls for that to go on to the Vineyard Frontrunner Station and then go down to UVU. So there are opportunities for connectivity to this service, and this will be an important backbone for that connectivity. It'll make things so that people are more willing to go on State Street and then get faster and quicker, you know, because I know you're a big UVX rider and a big fan of that. Connectivity to this Central Corridor project is critical to make the rest of the system work.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions before I move on?
I think you can go ahead.
Okay, and so I just, we wanted to share just a few cross sections of what this transit investment would look like in the roadway network. This is still kind of a high level look, understanding that the typical section kind of varies along the length of State Street 500 West. But really a driving factor, you know, that the top cross section is the existing cross section, the bottom one is proposed. And what we're proposing is, you know, BRT center running in its own lane. And so with that type of transit investment, it obviously means we have to kind of restructure how things are fitting within the roadway prism itself. And so this will be something that is refined quite a bit more once we go into environmental. But we are showing in this kind of future right-of-way section, once again, the center running BRT, where there is kind of existing, there's a two-way left-hand turn lane that would go away, and that's where the BRT would run. We are still showing a shoulder parking section in the right-of-way, as well as sidewalks, which generally with most transit investments, we need to show sidewalks as well, especially if we're looking at going for federal funding. That access to station locations is really important. And here is just another section. Sorry, this is a little bit further south on State Street. Once again, just showing that things will move around a little bit in terms of amount of park strip, where shoulders are going to be, roadway widths, that kind of thing. And all these details will be worked out further as the project goes along. But just recognizing that this does have implications on the roadway network as it exists today. And before we kind of wrap up, we just wanted to talk about our public involvement to date. And we've had really great responses from the community all along the corridor. We've had about 250 comments from unique individuals to date. I think with over 750 kind of unique sentiments within those comments. We've had a lot of great targeted response, which we all like to hear because it means people are understanding our project and able to give us really specific feedback that we can then take and use to shape how we're moving forward. And so what we have been hearing for the public is really a lot of support for what has evolved into our preferred alternative. So really just a strong desire for that north-south movement along State Street. And there was also a lot of support expressed for connecting to Vineyard, specifically for that future development there and tying into Frontrunner. We did hear that east-west connectivity to Frontrunner is really important. And this isn't just at Vineyard, it's at Orem and American Fork and Lehigh. And so I know Mary could probably speak to this at great length, but this is really important. This project is not intended to solve every single transit problem in Utah County, but we do recognize that those east-west connections to Frontrunner are really important. And I know moving forward, that's a charge to UTA to continue to provide that service. In general, we did hear quite a bit of support for the project, though we did hear our normal general concerns about worrying about roadways getting too wide to accommodate transit, additional safety impacts to pedestrians or vehicles on the road, or if having transit in its own right of way is going to create additional congestion. So those are kind of our normal concerns we generally hear with projects of this type. But we're really happy to hear this kind of level of feedback at this stage of the process. We are moving towards the end of our process here. We're kind of into our final stage of just doing some engineering refinements, ridership optimization, looking at funding, strategies, operations, planning. This bullet here on providing recommendations to jurisdictions on land use policies, zoning changes, that's really intended for all of the jurisdictions along the corridor, just to make sure that the right policies and practices are in place to support this investment and make it as successful as possible. And then finally, I just want to note that we are in our final public comment period right now. We're going to have a virtual open house on October 26th and 29th. I believe we have folks from our PI team that have been coordinating with all the cities on helping get the word out. We do have more information at centraltransit.utah.gov. And that concludes what I wanted to say. Mary, do you want to conclude with any final remarks?
Oops, muted.
I couldn't get my mute to undo. I always have final comments. This project is a really career highlight for me, because having been someone who's worked for over 30 years in city government, I believe that good planning comes from city government, who are the closest to the people. And this project is clearly driven by Provo and the 6 other cities that are involved. And I just love being a part of that. One of the things that we will be looking closely at, and Claire mentioned this, is the connectivity to the current UVX line. And we have some intent to study having the current UVX line will end at the Orem Frontrunner. Perhaps it should go north on Geneva to the Vineyard Frontrunner station, east on 800 north in Orem to cross so that it connects with the Central Corridor Transit Project, so that you get that connectivity and better flow for that branch, which we think is an important part of the project. I'd love to take any of your questions, concerns, or comments.
Thank you to you both. Any questions? Got just a couple of minutes. Ms. Ellsworth, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is really exciting. I'm curious how we can work with UTA more in the future on expanding transit within Provo. Is there an individual we should contact, or an organization, an element of your organization we should work with?
I'm your person.
Okay.
Anytime. Anytime. I would love to come and talk to you more about transit.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to update us, and we certainly share your enthusiasm and hope that we can get this right and really make the improvements that we need for our community, but also the interconnection of our community with the rest of the valley. I think it's pretty clear that we're a population that likes to move a lot and move a lot within, proximate areas because of, networks and social networks and connections that are varied. And this is going to be even more important with each passing year. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'll be joining you next week when you have a work session on transportation transit issues. So thank you all.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thanks for being with us. All right. We'll move on to our last item on the work agenda, which is a discussion regarding the renewal of certain requirements related to COVID-19 and to the COVID-19 pandemic responses, including face coverings and public gatherings. This will be presented by Cliff Strachan. 60 minutes for this item. Oops, you're muted.
My apologies. Council, I will introduce the topic, and Brian will walk you through any of the legal options that you want to consider. As you know, the state has moved to a new measuring index, if you will, a transmission index, in which Utah County is rated as a high transmission area. And we continue to have an outsized portion of cases compared to our population in the state. Provo and Orem, to different degrees, continue to, at least one area after another, seems to be part of the hot spots. Earlier this week, west side of Provo was listed as one of the top 3 hot spots in the county. That said, Utah County yesterday rescinded its public health order or its mask mandate in favor of the state's program. And that looks to be where they're going to stay for at least for some time. Really what you've got to come and consider now is you've been asked to, the original ordinance that you passed basically said that if you don't renew it today, the ordinance in chapter 9.25 would expire on November 15th, 2020. That said, I think underlying your full decision is really, if you think the new regulations handed down by the state are going to be sufficient, then you may want to repeal. If you think the state regulations are inadequate, perhaps on the side of not the state requirements are reactive and not necessarily proactive. So there's that element to it. But the decision you as a council need to decide is, I think underlying is, first of all, with what the state is now doing and tracking, is that sufficient to consider a change to our ordinance, whether it be to repeal, to suspend, or on the other side of it, to extend? That's the discussion I think you need to have. We asked John Magnus and Brian Jones to work on some possible ordinances. So we have a repeal option, a suspension option, and I can't remember the third one right now, or just an extension option. So Brian's going to now walk you through and probably lead the rest of this discussion with you.
Great, thanks, Cliff. There's a part of me that's tempted to say, Cliff did such a great job, why don't you just take over the discussion? But I'm worried I'm mostly just going to repeat what he said. But at the end of the day, the reason why this is on your agenda today, entirely separate from the state's action, is that as you originally passed the ordinance back the end of August that applies to Provo City and requires face coverings in certain circumstances in Provo City, when it was passed and as it is currently written, if you take no action today, that ordinance will expire on November 15th and will no longer be in effect, will be automatically repealed and removed from the code book. So it's been, regardless of recent state and county action, it was always the intent, since that was passed in August, for this item to be on the agenda for today, for you to make a decision about that. Now that the state has rolled out its plan that came out last week, that does maybe affect your decision-making process a little bit. And at the end of the day, with reference to that decision, you have really a two-part decision. The first step of which is to decide, do you want to in some way try to coexist with the state rules and have there be rules in Provo at the same time that the state has rules, and that those may not be in concert and may conflict in some ways? And we can talk through this discussion about whether that's even possible or not. There is some confusion on that because the state has issued some public-facing documents that say that their new guidelines don't preempt local mandates, but the actual order that they have issued doesn't say that. And so there's nothing in the actual order that talks about the effect that it might have on local ordinances, which raises some unique legal arguments about whether Provo's requirements and mandate is even actually in effect at this moment or could be enforced. But in any event, if you were to go with that decision, you have one way of doing that, which is to extend the expiration date on the current ordinance. Your other choice, besides trying to, what I'll term, coexist with the state rules, is to step out of the way and let the state rules be the only rules that apply. In that option, you actually have three different ways that you could do that. One of those is to do nothing today and just let the Provo ordinance lapse on November 15th. That kind of sidesteps this question of whether both of them can be enforced at the same time and ignores it for the next 3 weeks. But leaves the ordinance in effect from now until November 15th, and then it would automatically expire. You could take action tonight to repeal the ordinance so that it's immediately withdrawn as soon as the mayor signs the repeal, or 15 days after the repeal is presented to her for signature. Or you could try to figure out some way to leave the Provo ordinance on the books, but suspend its application until such time as some triggering event happens. And that's probably the option out of all of them that will require the most decision points for you, because you would need to decide what are the time periods for which the ordinance doesn't apply, what are the criteria that have to be in effect for it not to apply, and when it springs back into action, what triggers that and for how long, and is there still a termination clause after it springs back into application or not. Then I think we talked about in some of the emails over the last few days that all of those actions, other than doing nothing and letting it lapse, are legislative in nature and therefore have some consequences down the road as far as how others react to them. Anyway, I think that's really all I wanted to say, except for to maybe answer questions, which I assume there are probably a few of.
Brian, I have a question. So under that was very helpful. I mean, I know you've sent us emails to this effect as well, but just even the verbal summary is helpful. Under the first two options, the doing nothing or repealing, and maybe for the sake of clarification, for the sake of the public, help us understand what, if any, would be obstacles to reissuing any kind of a new ordinance at any future date.
I don't think that there are any obstacles to issuing it. And I wasn't finished with my sentence yet, so let me say it this way. I don't think that the obstacles to reissuing a new one in the future are any different than the obstacles to suspending the current one and having it spring back into action at a later date. What I mean by that is a new ordinance. Let's say you wanted to, let's say just for the sake of argument that in December the state decides there's no longer an emergency and they get rid of the order and the state of local health emergency. And in January, with students coming back to the university, there's a feeling that there needs to be some regulations here in Provo, and the state no longer has any regulations. If the council were to want to pass an ordinance, a new mask ordinance at that time, the new mask ordinance would be subject to veto by the administration and would be subject to referendum by citizens that were opposed to it. But when I say those aren't any different, if you were to take action tonight to suspend the current ordinance in order for it to spring back into action at a later time, that suspension would be subject to veto and referendum right now, just like future action would be subject to those that opposition in the future.
Thanks for that. And maybe just for the sake of my own contribution to the discussion, maybe a reason for that question is that I very much, as I think through my priorities, I very much want to be in harmony with the state. I am not, I don't relish the opportunity for confusing messages. I'm gratified by the action by the state because I think it was warranted. But as you have indicated, I think one of my major concerns is simply that it, as a reactive rather than a proactive ordinance, it's not clear what January looks like. I think it looks pretty clear what everything looks like up till then. At least, you know, I can imagine a scenario in which the rates go down. prior to, say, I don't know if it would be, sometime after Thanksgiving or maybe before if we're lucky, and that we're, back into the medium category and we get through the holiday season well enough. But we're going to have the return of 70,000 students again in January, and I do hope that we've learned some lessons from the fall semester, and that all parties concerned in terms of the universities and the city and our educational efforts, we would be more proactive in helping with that. There's some mitigating factors on the other side of the flu season and the cold weather and people being indoors more frequently that make it a more risky moment for us. But and we have a new governor who's stepping in, so it's not entirely clear what will happen with the state level. So, I mean, I'm sort of that's just where my concern would be. But I think if we've also learned from this experience, and maybe we would be prepared to return in early January if we so desired, to look carefully at where we are in terms of rates, and if we feel like we've had some good communication with all of those entities, and we feel like it's worth seeing if we can get ourselves through that first week or so without bad results. And if we do get them, then the state order kicks in, or if the state order is not there, the governor's will isn't there, then we can take action. Anyway, I'm just sort of publicly airing some of the things that I know are on all of our minds as we head toward the next couple of months. But I think it's important for all of us to be considering that very likely scenario in January, where I will mention where we have the return of those students and the risk of spikes again. I do know that BYU, I think you're all aware, has delayed the semester by 1 week. And that is primarily, so it's January 11th, if I'm remembering correctly. That is primarily to allow students more time to have sort of symptom-free health leading up to the return. And if they're not, they're of course not going to be encouraged to return until they are. So that's at least a helpful step, I think, that BYU is already proactively taken on that. Let's see, Mr. Shipley has had his hand up first, and then Mr. Harding.
I just wonder if Cliff or Brian could give me some clarification. If these two rules were to continue to coexist over the next 3 weeks, and we just allowed this to expire as opposed to repealing it, can we speak to the differences just a little bit for the sake of the public and myself? Our version of what this is versus what the state has, so that we understand what exists. If what kinds of things could create confusion over the next 3 weeks if we allow it to continue, and whether or not we can, do that without creating more problems, or whether or not communicating a repeal would actually communicate more problems. If the media caught hold of a repeal, of our mask mandate, that might cause more confusion than just allowing this to expire. So anyway, I'd like to get the one specific question I have is signage for businesses, and whether or not that's within the state mandate. I'm just not familiar enough with it to know.
Signage requirements are part of the state rules. I would have to pull it up and look at it here in a second to see exactly what they are, but they did include signage requirements in their mandate. To your other question about the kind of the difference between repeal and lapse, let me kind of start backwards and say what's the downside of repeal, and I think that's more political than it is legal. You raised the question about what if the media gets a hold of it. I noticed that having read through the county's order where they rescinded theirs, they specifically spell out that the reason for rescission is because of the implementation of the state rules, and that they are adopting and getting behind the state rules and encouraging everyone to abide by those rather than simply repealing it. that doesn't prevent there from being a headline. I think I just saw a few minutes ago a headline from KUTV News that, you know, Utah County rescinds mask order in midst of pandemic surge, right? So, and I didn't go and read the article. I just saw that was the clickbait title on on the internet, right? So that could certainly happen. As far as the downside of leaving it in place, I think the biggest downside is probably a potential for confusion that people, well, and I suppose a perception of there could, and again, these are not really legal answers, right? There could be a perception of distrust. There could be a perception of lack of support for the state rules. There could be some frustration on the part of citizens about, well, what am I supposed to do with the fact that there's two and that the rules don't line up? Now, that's presuming they even know that or are educated about that. There are some conflicts. The exceptions don't line up perfectly. And so one of the, so here's a legal example, right, to answer your question. One of the issues that I've raised in some of the emails recently is that, like I said a few minutes ago, although the state says that local mandates are not affected by their order, they haven't specifically authorized any local mandates, and their order doesn't say anything about local mandates. So what if someone is abiding by the state regulation, and in a situation where the state regulation and the Provo regulation both would require wearing a mask, but they aren't wearing a mask because of an exception that exists in the state order, but that same exception doesn't exist in the Provo order? Are they in violation of the Provo ordinance or not? And from a legal perspective, I have some concerns about that being kind of an open question that I'm not sure I can easily answer for you. And so that, without kind of going into more detail or calling our ordinance into question anymore, that's the kind of legal problem that could arise. Does that answer your question, or are you looking for more detail than that?
No, that's kind of what I was looking for. I guess if there's something, if there's like a situation where somebody was to call into question something that's not consistent between a state policy and the city policy, I guess I wouldn't be interested in us trying to, to create more confusion with that, or to try to, I don't know. I don't have any desire to, and that's why I guess my question was more directed toward what are the key differences that would create that confusion. I'm not familiar enough with the state mandate to understand why someone would be totally perplexed or confused at this point of what the rule is. I think, the gist of the rule is a wear your mask, right? So I don't know, that somebody's going to look into the details and be worried that they're not following one rule or the other. I don't know if I should be more concerned about that. I guess I'm just not concerned that somebody's going to be nervous about that. And so I just wonder, is there something I'm missing?
My guess, and this is purely a guess and not really a legal analysis, but my guess is that 99% of the population will be operating under the belief that there's a state mandate, and they're going to worry about whether they're abiding by the state mandate, and they probably won't even pay attention to whether Provo still exists or not. But that's just a guess on my part. I guess I would, in reference to your comment about specific differences, probably the biggest difference is that the state one requires mask wearing even outdoors if you are not social distancing, regardless of group size. And whereas Provo's doesn't require mask wearing outdoors unless you're in a group of more than 25 and not social distancing. And then the other big difference is that the state one prohibits casual social gatherings larger than 10 people, and this is probably where I would be most concerned about Provo's being misunderstood, is ours requires mask wearing in larger group gatherings than that, which could be interpreted by some people as authorizing larger gatherings than that, even though they are prohibited by the state ban.
Mr. Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I wanted to mention something on Mr. Jones's analysis earlier, where he said, you know, if we were to extend and suspend now, that could be, right now it's you know, open for a veto or a referendum question. And if we waited until later and tried to implement something in the future, it would also be open for veto. I think one difference, though, is if we were to extend and suspend, the current ongoing referendum effort would still apply to that because it applies to the underlying ordinance. And so the effort that's already underway could run to completion, and if they achieve the sufficient signatures, that then gets put onto the ballot. Whereas if we were to repeal or let it expire and then at some future date go back and create something, then I don't think they could rely on what they're currently doing, but would have to start over. And so I think that is one difference between those two things.
And Mr. Harding, Councilor Harding, I would agree with that, with this nuance, that I think that if they wanted to, they could also start a second referendum on tonight's action.
Correct.
One concurrently with the other.
Correct. And yes, that's true. That's true. Thank you. So as I think most of you know, I have kind of looked at all four of the options, and I've been back and forth, and I'm really torn on what I think makes the most sense. I do want to say that though I disagree with the sponsors of the referendum effort, I do think that, you know, everything we did was legal and in the best interest of the community. I still respect their right to follow this process. And so I think one of the things one of the strongest arguments against repealing or against letting it expire would be, I wouldn't want to kind of undercut that effort. And so I guess I hope no matter what we do, that assuming they still disagree with the ordinance that we passed, a month and a half ago, I guess I would hope that they would continue on, you know, so and kind of run that to completion, because if we are considering that we might want to have another similar ordinance in the run up to January, or you know, if things really go bad, you know, late into next year, just not knowing what's going to happen, you know, it might be good if they're able to run that to completion and kind of get that feedback. And if they get those signatures, even if it say it expires, and they're able to get sufficient signatures, I think that's going to inform us in the future if we were desirous of implementing a new ordinance. So I guess I hope that if we repeal or if it expires, it'd be nice if that could run to completion, but I don't know if that's, you know, I don't know how that all plays out. I think right now I am leaning towards a repeal, and that is because a month and a half ago things were very different. We suspected a surge was coming, but we didn't see the surge yet. We've had the surge. It hasn't come back to the previous levels, but it has come down from its current high. In the meantime, we've had a county ordinance with some of these regulations, and now we currently have a state order with some of these restrictions. And so I think things have changed quite a bit, which I think was one of the reasons why we put in like a sunset clause, was just realizing that we don't know what was coming. Well, we now know what has come, at least up to this point. And so I think it's very reasonable to react to that. And I think I do like the idea of sending a clear message that we support the current state requirements. We're going to step and get out of the way with those currently in place. We feel confident that it covers what we're concerned about. And then hopefully we can, nimbleness is not necessarily a quality of a council, but if we can be as nimble as possible, take the current situation and our best guess of what's coming shortly down the line, you know, maybe we can say, well, we don't know what the state thing is going to be in January, but in the run up to January, we'll have a better idea. And so maybe we can look and see if it makes sense to augment, and we could tailor an ordinance much better to work around what the state is doing, rather than something that existed long before that the state and the state requirements, the state order came into effect. So with that, and I know I've said a lot, so I'll stop here in just a moment, but with that, I think the administration can be much more nimble than we can. And I think we did our best to work together in the past, and we tried to work that out. We weren't able to come to terms, so the council moved forward with what we did, and I think the administration did admirably to implement the policy that we enacted. I'm hopeful maybe in the run up to January, if we don't know what the situation's going to be like, but when we get to that point, perhaps we can work with them and with the understanding that if they don't do it, we're going to do it. So maybe we could work with them and get a nimble solution that can change more rapidly than our process, if that's the case. So I guess I'm just looking forward, but at the current time, right now at least, and I'm interested to hear what other people think and arguments they have, but right now I'm leaning towards a repeal today. Get out of the way, let the state take over, and we'll continue to monitor and fill in where we need to in the future.
Brian, can I ask a quick clarification, and before I turn to you, Mr. Fillmore? Is it your judgment that if we let it expire, does that somehow undermine the referendum effort? I assumed that was not the case, that would actually allow that process to continue.
Well, I suppose it all depends on what you mean by undermine, and that probably has a lot to do, I think, with speculation on what the sponsors are trying to achieve and what their hope is. I mean, at the end of the day, the referendum effort has already, in my view, has already been undermined by the implementation of both the county and the state mandates, because even if even in the scenario in which they continued to gather signatures, gathered sufficient signatures, the referendum certified, the Provo ordinance stayed on the books through November, and the election was actually held, under the current scenario that presently exists, that would afford them no victory because the state mandate would still exist. At least no victory in the sense of not having to wear masks. But if the victory is political in nature, of solely having sent a message, then maybe it's undermined by that. To the same, you could take the flip side view of it and say it's a mercy to let them know that it's not going to be on the ballot on November because there is no law in place and will be no law in place, instead of having them gather all the signatures and then having it lapse on November 15th and then telling them, well, now that you got all the signatures, it's still not going to be on the ballot. So I think I don't know how to answer that question other than to speculate about how they might feel about any of those different options.
Thank you. Mr. Fillmore, go ahead.
Just a handful of observations, Mr. Chairman. It appears to me that we still have quite a few political disputes on all sides. But more importantly, we have a lot of medical disputes still. Based on all the emails I get, and I think you all would agree, you can find a study or a report or anecdotes just about anywhere to support just about any position you want to take at this point. And the state appears to be all in on masks, but if we gave it more time, we'd have more data, and I think their conclusions would be clearer. Even if there's no apparent enforcement mechanism with the state's mandate, I think continued scientific study would be valuable to the state and to our city if we want to do something later. I'm kind of tipping my hand here. I'm kind of inclined towards repeal. In August, when we worked through our ordinance, we all, I think, had a desire to be proactive. And we sensed that 60,000 plus college students were returning to the area. We were very concerned about that. We wanted to be supportive of the two universities in our area. We want to be supportive of our healthcare community. We want to be supportive of our public schools. I think those are all very good motivations. And for one, I'm glad we did that. Now we have the county came through, and now they've withdrawn their mandate because they want to be in harmony with the state. I think that that makes a lot of sense, frankly. Brian has indicated there's some ambiguity with respect to the state health department order, with respect to whether it's absolute preemption or whether there's an exemption for communities like our own. I suspect in the end, we're going to find that that is preemptive, that the state mandate will be clear. They won't want a lot of local exceptions because it creates confusion. The key for me is clarity with our citizens, that they know what the standard is. And the second key is that we do everything we can to keep our schools and businesses open. Last thing we want is another across the board closure of schools and businesses. That was very traumatic, very problematic for many people who lost jobs, and the economy, of course, took a big hit. And so my thought is that we ought to present a united front for now with the administration. That schism has been problematic in its own right. I think if we're in line with what the administration wants to do, which is also totally in line with what the state is now requiring, that our educational efforts will be far better, much more clear, much more consistent. I think we need to avoid any confusion we can. I mean, there was a time before yesterday when we had three sets of ordinances as city, county, and state, and that was going to be terribly confusing in the short run and the long run. And I think as I look at the state's order, it's a public health order. I see several good things. I see that it's based on objective transmission data in terms of their various levels and requirements. They have a good signage requirement. They're generally focused on groups, not individuals. And for the most part, they have adopted our exemption, which are important. I confess I don't see anything in the state health department's order about enforcement. They do have the option of the health department, state health department, and through the state, the county health departments taking certain actions, I suppose, but those are primarily with businesses, not individuals or citizen groups. But in that respect, they're really no different than ours. I mean, we put some teeth in our ordinance with respect to some civil fines, but the administration has chosen not to enforce those, not to utilize them at all. And so as a practical matter, our ordinance is not enforced in any significant way. And so bottom line for me is I'd be in favor of repeal. Just a clear-cut break. Urge the city administration to educate our populace with respect to what the state's requiring and how that works. And I think if we have to do it immediately, and if we have a feeling that that's inadequate come January, then we're in a position to do a new ordinance. By that time, hopefully, we have a little bit more information, better data in terms of what the facts are as a medical and scientific matter. So I would be supportive of a repeal.
Sorry, Ms. Ellsworth.
Yeah, I think I'm in favor of just letting it expire. I think that's a reasonable expectation that we set when we created the ordinance. I don't think it's too confusing. I think people understand that wherever you go in the city or in the county and in many parts of the state, you need to wear a mask. And I think if anything, these ordinances support each other. While there is some overlap, I think that citizens are smart enough to navigate that. And if there is some loophole, I'm sure that the teams who are enforcing this, if any, are enforcing it will understand that there is some nuance where there is overlap. So I'm in favor of just letting it lapse or expire on the given date, November 15th. And I think that we need to be prepared for January when all of the students come back and we have a different governor and there will be a different situation.
Mr. Harding.
Thank you. I wanted to kind of second everything that Mr. Fillmore said. I think that's kind of the general line of reasoning that I have now, and the reason why I'm leaning towards repeal as of now. I did want to mention though that right now I can go on the internet and find a theory that suggests that the Earth is flat, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a preponderance or even beyond a reasonable doubt that the Earth is in fact round. And similarly, we can find studies or theories about all of the scientific and medical aspects of COVID and the responses or the things we can do to protect ourselves. But really, it's very clear that masks are effective and social distancing is effective, and these things do reduce the transmission rate. So I do think we need to embrace that.
Mr. Jones?
Just a couple comments really quick. One, I heard a few comments about the state rules being reactive rather than proactive. And I get where that's coming from. I think that's generally true in the way that the state order is written. Although from a conversation I had earlier today, I'd point out a couple of ways in which I think the actual implementation could arguably be considered to actually be proactive in the sense. And so here are two examples. One is that despite the fact that the moderate transmission level does not require mask wearing, that during the transition phase over the next 2 weeks, they issued a separate order that requires masks even in the moderate transmission area for the rest of October, essentially. The other one that occurs to me is that recognizing that the data in some of the smaller counties may not really be sufficient to give them as much certainty as they would like, they actually created in one of the footnotes a methodology for putting some counties in a review status rather than actually transitioning them to the status that they would apparently qualify for based on the numbers. I point both of those out along with the fact that there are university populations in several other cities throughout the state to say that I think that despite the general reactive nature of the way the state program has been written, that they have made an effort to take into account ways in which that model might not address every situation with certainty, and to show that they have the ability to think proactively about ways that the model might need to be changed. So I throw that out there by way of saying, one possibility, assuming that let's assume in mid-December that everything is as it is now with regard to that state plan, but that Provo's data has dropped and there's a concern it will surge. One possibility might be for Provo elected officials to reach out to the governor and say, hey, even though our data suggests that we ought to drop, can you put us in review status until the end of January? And maybe that is actually even the right answer for every city with a university or something like that. Anyway, I think I just wanted to point out that I think there are ways that even the framework that they have implemented could be adapted for the concerns that some of you have mentioned.
Sorry. I just wanted to respond to that, Mr. Jones. That's very helpful for me. I think that's, like I said early on, that's been my biggest concern. And I know there's a lot of moving parts here, especially with a new governor coming in on board, that we would, need to have that conversation. But that would be, I'm willing to give it that chance, right? I mean, I repeat what I said earlier. I want to be in line. I think it's better that we have statewide action on this than or state directed action on this, even if it isn't statewide. It's certainly more broad than a city. And I know that the mayor had reservations about a patchwork solution to the problem all along, as did, I think, all of us. The problem was that the all the entities above us were sort of leaving it to the lower entities to make the decision. And so that inevitably means you're going to create a patchwork solution to a problem unless you're going to do nothing. So I think we did the right thing in taking the initiative that we took. I think we sent a message that we understood the importance of being proactive. And I think we saw what we anticipated was going to happen. I think it could have been worse. I don't, it's obviously an uncertain, one of the uncertainties of the science isn't whether or not masks are effective, it's whether or not our mandate had the effect that we wanted it to have. I think that's going to be, that would be very difficult to prove definitively, but I don't think there's any question that we acted on the right principles with the right caution. And if there's the possibility of that kind of action going forward, I think we should strongly urge the state to do so. And I don't, as far as like whether or not we repeal or just let it expire, which is really the only two options that I'm contemplating at this point. I think for me, the biggest difference would be what kind of signal it sends. And I have some reservations about the signal that it sends, based on previous media reports, that it sends the wrong message, that somehow we're acknowledging that we're not in a serious situation. We're in the worst situation we've ever been. But we think that a broader solution is better than a narrow one. And we want to collaborate. So if there's a way to put language into a repeal that's very strong about the importance of what the state is doing, and maybe even some language in there that indicates our concern going forward about, I don't know, Brian, you can advise on this, but maybe it doesn't need to be in our actions today, but I think starting today, I would like that message to get sent all the way to the governor's office that we are not going to be doing our due diligence here if we're sitting idly by waiting for something bad to happen in January, when we know that that's a very likely possibility and that we will benefit greatly from help and collaboration across, Provo and Orem and across the county and with the state's assistance. Mr. Strachan has an inability to raise his hand, so he's asked me to call on him, but then I'll go through the order. I have Ms. Ellsworth next. Go ahead.
Could I finish the other half of my comment?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I think what you just said was a segue right into what I was wanting to say, which is, let me frame any discussion that you might be having over the next half hour as far as about what you might want to do in this meeting, which is that our normal course of business is in our evening meetings to have an ordinance or a resolution to which an implied motion applies, and which is automatically voted on during the meeting unless someone makes some kind of substitute motion. In this case, we didn't really get that far. So one option you have is to leave it the way it is and not do anything in this meeting, and in the discussion tonight to, at that time, have a full discussion about all the options over again and have someone make a motion about one of the specific options to follow. The other option you have right now is to make a motion to signal what the preferred alternative is. That would allow, for example, in accordance with what you just said, that would allow for a couple things. It would allow for staff to work a little bit more on the language of a repeal ordinance if we know that's the preferred option and that's what the implied motion is going to apply to between now and this evening. It also perhaps signals to the public a little bit how to frame the public comment period that would precede council discussion, as far as giving them an idea where the council is headed and not having 50 people call in to say, don't do what you're already not planning to do, kind of thing, which has happened on occasion. And then just the final comment, also throw out there that one of the options in that motion, if a motion were to be made right now, if the motion is to just let the ordinance lapse, there is actually no legal requirement or reason that this item must be on the evening meeting. Because if you take no action in the evening meeting, it automatically lapses and there doesn't need to be a discussion of that option. So one possibility would be just to make a motion to remove this from the evening meeting, which would result in the lapse option. I just throw that out there because I don't know if anybody thought through that logistical concept.
Very helpful. Thanks, Mr. Strachan. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually am glad that Brian did that and helped frame what we need to decide. And like I say, if all 7 of you will get through kind of your preferences, you get a sense of where you're all at. I would say to you that announcing prior to the item or at some point in the evening meeting what the action is intended to be or the implied motion will be helpful. The point I wanted to make when I asked you to call on me, George, was that given what we're seeing with the KUTV and the kind of the Twitter statements that are being made right now on the Utah County, is that whatever the city decides to do tonight or the council decides to do tonight, we on your staff will need to get ahead on the public information that we provide out to the newspaper and to the media, the other media, so that we get ahead of what it really means. So if you do rescind, you still are very much in support, is my understanding of what the state is doing. You want to get behind that. And just like with the county is that if the city gets rid of the mask mandate, we are still standing for masks. Now, you also already have a resolution that's in place that we can refer people back to that talks about the importance of masks and the education that goes with it.
All right, Ms. Ellsworth, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious if we rescind this today, if we repeal it, which I'm not in favor of, how would some kind of big party organized by maybe students or somebody, how would that be enforced on, or how would we avoid that? And what would we do to prevent that?
Well, I think that our officers, assuming they were the ones that might be called, or would have the same, or county health officials would have the same opportunity they have now, which would be to go to that location and inform them that under the state health order, they're not allowed to have a gathering of more than 10 individuals and that masks are required, and educate them about that legal requirement.
What if it's not a casual social gathering, that it's an organized social gathering?
Well, an organized social gathering in the sense that, I have to look at the definition of that, but it's like, I mean, that would, in my view, that would require like the university or the student ward or something to organize it. I have to look at the definitions again. Let's see, casual gathering.
Brian's looking that up. Brian mentioned to me earlier that the state's defying a state public order carries with it a higher penalty than our ordinance does. And so that's also a possibility, even though I don't sense that the state wants to enforce, they just want people to comply with it.
So a casual social gathering is any gathering of individuals from separate households at the same time in the same place that does not involve formal oversight from a sponsoring person. So if you're going to take the position that the, say, dance or party organizer is the sponsoring person who is invoking formal oversight, the group size requirement doesn't trigger, but that person then becomes an event host who is responsible to do even more than what our ordinance requires. They must require every individual to wear a mask. They must complete the event management template provided by the state health department, and they must require 6 feet of physical distance between individuals from separate households, unless they get a waiver from the local health officer. So they've got to fall under one of the two categories. Either they're casual and they can't be more than 10, or they're formal, in which case they have to meet all the requirements of an event host. Now the penalty question is an interesting one, and I don't know what state and county health officials intend to do about alleged violations.
Thanks, Brian.
Mr. Sewell.
Dave, you're muted.
Mr. Sewell.
Thank you. Wonder how many times we have to do that before we remember. I've been really conflicted on this as well, whether to repeal or just let it expire. But this discussion has really helped clarify my thinking. I have a strong preference now. I think that there's a lot of value in clarity and combining our educational efforts toward one set of standards. So to me, that argues for repeal. I also think, as we've talked about the differences, I've been comparing the two. The state ordinance is really much stronger than ours in terms of what it allows. I mean, outdoors, you have to have masks, even if there's 3 people, unless you're social distancing. Indoors, there's no exemption for social distancing. If you're in an indoor public setting, you should be wearing a mask. I mean, not counting the exemptions. The limit on the size of social gatherings is much stricter. So I feel like this is probably what we need right now. And I feel like the state has a pretty good criteria that they've set up for when we could drop back down to the next lower level. And that would really give everyone something to work toward. As the mayor has mentioned, this would be the administration's preference. It'd be great to have her on board. My biggest hesitation, though, is we came into this with a unanimous vote on a very, very tough issue, and we've all taken arrows for it. And I don't know if Councillor Ellsworth would want me to say this, but an email from her is actually what got me thinking about it. Initially, she was the first one to really get me stewing over this and realizing that, hey, if we don't do something more, I mean, this is going to have a serious effect on public health, and lives could be lost. So anyway, all I'm trying to say is I would prefer if there's some way we can all be together on this again. And so I would be, even though I do have a strong preference for repeal, if the simplicity of just taking it off the agenda tonight and letting it expire, if that works as a way to get us all on the same page, I'd be okay with that as well.
Mr. Shipley.
Yeah, thank you. I can appreciate what Mr. Sewell just mentioned, and I've had some of those same feelings. I guess I'm trying to weigh the simplicity of the education, matching with what the state does, and a potential risk of messaging something wrong this evening if we were to vote to repeal our own mandate. And for me, the potential of that risk of undoing something that I feel like we have a higher ground on now is enough of a risk that I'd rather us take it off the agenda tonight and allow this to expire. I guess I'm confused at why the administration would not be able to support the state mandate 100%, even if we were to leave our mandate on for the next 3 weeks. I mean, why can't we communicate the state rules and support for the state even with Provo's ordinance in place for 3 more weeks? And if we do that, and there's not a problem in doing that, then I think it greatly outweighs us potentially having a messaging problem this evening by repealing something that many people will look to the first half of a headline, this evening, and the first half of a headline is going to be that Provo repealed its mandate. And even if the follow-up is that they're in full support of the state mandate, and even if the follow-up article is very clear that that's what has happened here, that we're fully supportive of the state mandate, I'm not confident that the average person is going to continue that far. I just think it might lessen some of what we've established at this point, and I'm very concerned about that. So I guess I'm trying to weigh whether or not, the administration being able to support what the state's doing with our mandate still in place is such a problem. And I'm confused as to why that would be a problem. I don't think the average citizens looking into both mandates and trying to figure out the differences between the two, I don't think the layers cause as much confusion as people may think it does. I think the average person is just going to default and wear a mask if they feel like that's the rule, and the average person that doesn't want to wear a mask is still going to do that, regardless of the nuances of the rule differences. And so I guess I'm not as concerned about that as I am with what we message from here. And if taking it off the agenda tonight, and if having this work session where we all are very supportive of the state mandate and the new rules that are as they are, I think that might do what we're trying to accomplish and make less of an issue of a change in ordinance that might cause confusion.
Mr. Jones.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple comments based on a couple statutes that I've discovered while we've been having this conversation, which I think are probably applicable here. One, to the preemption issue, I've now found a provision in State Code 26123 that it really applies to local health departments rather than to cities, but it specifically provides that local health standards may not be more stringent than federal or state standards. So I think there's, and again, it's not directly on point and isn't 100% binding on the city, but I think that it has some value as far as the argument that we said later that we talked about earlier, that I think there's a pretty strong argument for the city and for the legal advice of the legal department to the administration, if the city ordinance continues to be in effect, that enforcement should be focused on the state rules, and that the state rules are the ones that should be promoted and educated and enforced. And then with regard to the enforcement, I was saved by our chief prosecutor, who tracked down what I had not been able to find yet. And in section 2620-23-3 of the code, it specifically makes it unlawful to violate a state health order. And in section 6 of that part makes it a Class B misdemeanor, enhanceable to a Class A misdemeanor for repeat offenses, and also invokes civil penalties for persons and corporations that violate lawful orders of the health department. So there are penalties in place, and those are penalties that could be invoked by health or law enforcement officials.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mayor Kafusi, and then Mr. Hoban.
I just wanted to speak to Councilmember Shipley's comments. This actually is exactly what I've been preaching from the beginning. Let's get in line with the professionals, the state health department, the county health department, and let's stay in line with them and let's follow their lead. Let's not go out rogue. I've always stated I'm not a health professional and I don't profess to be, so I depend on them. So we've stated right from the get-go when the governor came out with the new guidelines, which I love because it takes the politics out of it. It's all numbers and basically gives us a goal to reach, but it's from the health professionals. And if we want to get to this point, we have to work together and get to these different metric marks, this 14-day rolling. I don't see us coming out of that for quite a while. That's a lot of days. So no, this is exactly where I've been from the day the COVID-19 hit us, was let's get in line and let's not be out there on our own.
Mr. Hoban.
Well, Cliff had asked for everyone to provide some feedback so that the staff knows which direction to take. And I just want to say again, thanks to all my fellow council members who are just trying to do the right thing for everyone. This has been a really difficult couple months, weeks now. Trying to figure out what the next steps would be, but I appreciate all the work everybody's put into it. I think either a repeal or an expiration or a lapse kind of has the same effect. So I guess I could go either direction. So I might not be too helpful here, but I see value in just letting it lapse, and then I also see value in repealing it. It's hard to give I guess I would kind of lean towards Mr. Sewell's approach that, if we can have unanimity one direction or the other and have a united front, even have a united front possibly with the mayor, administration, I think that there's some value there. So, I guess I would follow probably Mr. Sewell's approach of, what can we all get behind? So maybe that leads toward more conversation, I guess. But I could go in either direction, but I do like Mr. Sewell's thoughts around that, around getting everybody behind this so that we have a good united message moving forward.
Mr. Paxman.
I thought what you shared, Mr. Shipley, was good and good questions and good thought processes there. I guess the way I view it is if this is a chance to applaud the state for what they've done, and if the desire is to move towards clarity, this is an opportunity to let that message be heard. You're probably right. Most people aren't going to read a lot of stories about this. I don't know if it's going to make much difference either way, whichever way you go. But that's the message that I like is we applaud the state for the direction they're taking, and we want to move towards clarity. If those are things the council supports, it doesn't seem to me to make a lot of sense to allow this one to go along and to fizzle. I don't know if there'll be a story written about it at all. There might be. Provo City takes no action, and eventually the thing lapses. But if we're looking for that clarity and for applauding the state for what they've done, the repeal seems to be the moment to get people's attention and to get that message across. And for those who don't read more than the headline, I guess they'll miss out on the message. But that's the opportunity that I think the repeal presents, is the chance to do those things.
Ms. Ellsworth.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting. We don't have to repeal it tonight, right? We could take no action. If we wanted to, we could probably repeal it in 2 weeks. If that's what we want to do. But I just think that things are constantly changing and the state cannot react as quickly as I think that we can. And the state doesn't know Provo as well as we do. And I think that we were elected to protect citizens, not necessarily just to follow the state or applaud the state. We need to be thinking about Provo citizens first. And everything's going to change in January, and we need to be proactive and not reactive. And the state right now seems to be reactive with these numbers. So it's important to me that we show the community that this is still a priority to us, that we're not repealing it, and that we still take all the precautions that we thought were necessary 2 months ago. We still take those seriously today.
So I think I need to clarify my views, because I've honestly been going back and forth on either expiration or repeal, and I'm not entirely sure I'm any closer to clarity on that. I do like what Mr. Paxman, just the way you just framed that. I do think that's an opportunity. I think there's, as we've acknowledged, there's some risk with that opportunity that may not go as well as we would like, but I think we can rely on our staff to send pretty strong messaging and so on. I mean, the thing that's obviously very appealing about expiring is that we don't have the discussion tonight. We don't have to create more fireworks than than is necessary here. And I think we would all agree that's extraordinarily appealing. So I just want to say something, and Mayor, I hope I don't sound too defensive about this, but and maybe I'll just speak for myself. I think the county failed us, and I'm going to just say that. I think the state failed us. We had 70,000 students arriving to Provo Orem, and we didn't get a word, at least I didn't, and maybe you did, but I didn't feel like we got enough warning. And maybe this is all lessons learned and it's water under the bridge, but we acted proactively because we worried that we would see the spikes that we got. And so I don't think we were inappropriately rogue. I think we were showing some leadership there. And I feel very defensive about that because we were consulting people. We weren't, I don't think we were making that decision without good medical and scientific advice. So I do think that still remains a concern come January. And that's why I hope we can be unified with you in sending a strong message. Whatever we do tonight, we're going to be in this position in January. And I go back to what Brian was saying earlier. I really like this idea of just making a hard run at the governor, at whoever the new governor is, and saying we need to make sure that we're careful and proactive, and something strong is in place. And obviously what you're already doing with the education program and with BYU and UVU will obviously continue. And I know BYU's learned a lot of lessons in terms of how they're tracing and using sewage studies and so on to help them be more nimble and react much more quickly to particular scenarios. But if we're united with you on this, that we want to send a strong message prior to the arrival. Because the problem we had back in August was the students arrived, and the way these things work, as well as it's been explained to me by public health experts, it's all about those conditions at the beginning. And if the conditions at the beginning are loose and the standards are unclear and expectations are unclear, then you know we're in a lot of trouble. And what I do like much better about this coming January, even though I don't like the flu season and the cold, is I do like that we have a strong citywide campaign going, that we've had strong messaging from UVU and BYU that was a little weak at the beginning when students arrived, and we weren't all of us, we were slow too on this. But I think now we can be in a position that January 1, you know, we get a lot of things amped up, and then hopefully, you know, we're in a position to be more reactive to that. But I'm not really answering the question. I guess I you know, like I say, I'm happy to go either way on expire or repeal. But I remain worried about the messaging, but maybe Mr. Paxman's comments help reassure me that rather than thinking of it merely as a problem, I can think of it as a solution, that we can count on the right message getting sent. Because I think it would be disastrous if the conclusion looks like, you know, we don't think there's a problem. I think the whole point is to applaud what has happened and to get in line with it, because I do think their wording and their ordinance will keep us protected as long as there isn't any confusion about that. So I guess I'm sort of slightly leaning toward repeal at this point with those caveats. Mr. Jones and then Mr. Harding.
Two comments, and the first one is really kind of triggered by what Mr. Paxman said, which is, I would just say, don't underestimate the ability of the press to twist your action whichever way they want to. and what I mean by that is, you know, the KU TV article that we just cited, I mean, part of that article is Provo City currently has a mask mandate, which is set to expire soon. The city council will be meeting Tuesday night to discuss the mandate. I think you should, and I think there's just as much chance, if your decision is to take it off and let it lapse, that you get a headline that says Provo City decides to let mask mandate lapse amid COVID surge. I think you're just as likely to get that headline as the headline about the repeal. And I think Cliff's comments earlier about, I think the real key is how your staff messages whichever one. And at least with the repeal, I think this was really Isaac's point, at least with the repeal, you have the opportunity to make a statement about why you're doing it, whereas with the lapse, you not as much, other than through your staff. But again, either way, I think I agree that there are competing interests there. Then legally, I wanted to just mention there was a comment about we could always repeal it later, which is true, but it's kind of a legal fiction in the sense that the way that the ordinance is written, if you don't renew it tonight, it will expire on the 15th and you cannot renew it after tonight. So you could repeal it on November 10th, but you're repealing something that has already lapsed and has no possibility of being renewed. So, take that for what it's worth. It has no legal impact, but it does, I suppose, give you an opportunity to make a statement on the 10th instead of a statement tonight, if you so desire.
Mr. Harding.
Thank you. I just wanted to do two things. One, I agree that, well, sorry, I should have had my thoughts put together a little bit better. I think early on the state encouraged local jurisdictions not to create mandates. So there was a point where before any local jurisdiction could create mask rules and things, they had to get permission from the state. And so I think at that point, I think there was no question they were discouraging local communities from doing that. Later on, though, the message I heard from the state was, we don't feel like it's appropriate for the state to do a full state mandate because different situations apply at different places. But we are encouraging local communities to do what is in the best interest of, in the conditions that are at each of these local, what basically to respond to the local conditions. So from that perspective, I don't feel like we were failed by the state because they were telling us, do what makes sense for your area. And so from that perspective, I don't think that the state failed us, but I also don't think that we acted inappropriately or that we should have waited for the, for direction from above, because I think we already were getting that direction. And I think we did exactly what we should have done. You could ask, you could quibble about the timing. Maybe we could have been a little bit quicker or whatnot. But in my take on that kind of disagreement there is that it's kind of right in the middle where I think we did what we needed to do, and I think it was appropriate, and I think we were following the state's direction on that. So anyway, that's my thought on that from what I saw. So with that said, I would like to make a motion that we make the motion to repeal, or the ordinance to repeal, or the whatever it is, I guess it's an ordinance to repeal. I would like to make that the implied motion for tonight's meeting, and I want to say that if there is insufficient support on the council for repeal, I will vote. I will not vote to let it expire. I'll support expiration if the repeal does not get sufficient council support. So that I won't stand in the way of unanimity for expiration. But I strongly, based on our discussion, I feel pretty strongly that I would like to see a repeal tonight. So that's why I made that motion.
Mr. Chairman, I will second that motion.
Sorry, I just have a quick procedural question. Was all of that part of the motion, or was the motion just the part about the implied?
The motion is only to make the implied motion for tonight's meeting apply to the repeal option.
Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Fillmore is seconded.
Correct.
I would just like to one point of discussion, and maybe I should just clarify what I meant by my comments about the county and the state. I don't want to I don't want to be misunderstood about that. First of all, what I am specifically referring to for me was there, and maybe this is all again 2020 hindsight at this point, but there were not significant warnings over the course of the summer that I heard about the prospect of things changing dramatically with the arrival of so many students. And I felt a little bit that we were a little bit alone in having that conversation, and we could have used some more warnings or I mean, even without anyone saying what you should do, you just need to know that that's going to change the formula and our assumptions about what's going forward, because I didn't hear anything about it. And I was, and so I do think that was a lapse of sufficient care there. And I don't know what explains it. I don't mean to be pointing fingers at individuals. I guess I'm just concurring with what you were saying, that I just wanted to clarify, at least from my perspective, what I thought were the very solid reasoning that we used to make the decision that we did, given the local conditions. And that's what I was saying earlier too. I think the problem was all along patchwork solutions were kind of necessarily going to be how this was going to get started, because there was an official position of neutrality on the part of the governor and on the part of the county early on about, what should be done about masks. So Mr. Hoban and then Mr. Shipley.
I think my comment's now irrelevant, so I'll pass.
Okay, Mr. Shipley.
And I'd just like to clarify that I'm supportive of either one of these. I guess my comment was more directed towards, I'm trying to weigh what I think are risks of how this will be viewed by the public versus what would be a problem if we let it expire. I agree with Mr. Paxman's comment that it does do us some marginal good to act in support of the governor and use this as an opportunity to act in support of the new policy that's out there. And so if the council agrees that that this is messaging support for that, as opposed to creating an excuse for people who don't want to follow a mandate, to feel like they've got some reason not to going forward, then I'm fully supportive of either one and would support this if the council's behind it.
Ms. Ellsworth.
Yes, I appreciate the counselors who have mentioned that they want to be in line with the state. I think that makes a lot of sense. My question is will we continue to support the next governor if they overhaul this entire system and make it more restrictive or less restrictive? Are we just going to delegate authority to the governor on this issue, including the next governor?
Well, maybe I'll respond to that. I certainly don't believe we will. I mean, at least I think I can speak for us. I think what I've heard today is that we would not defer all judgment to the state. I think what we're trying to do, look, from my perspective, the city ordinance was rendered much more effective, or our efforts to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 were greatly increased when we were joined by the county and then by the state, because there's just a significant limitation placed on any city's ability, especially in our culture where people travel so frequently between Provo and Orem, between Provo and Salt Lake City, or anywhere else along the Wasatch Front. There never was any sense to a limited patchwork solution. I think this was always going to be what we needed to solve this problem. And I think that's the message that we would want to send. I think as a last resort, if we're not protected by either county or statewide action, I think we're back where we were. And I don't think we've shown that we have the capacity and courage to show leadership on that if we have to. But I think our hope is that this represents a change in approach that is improved and is going to be more effective in helping the state get things under control. Mr. Sewell. Whoops, you're muted again.
Probably up to about 20 times I've done that now. So I don't think we should delegate our responsibility to look at the unique conditions of Provo and do what we think is best to preserve the health and safety of our citizens. So I don't think tonight's decision has anything to do with what we might or might not do in January. That's my, depending on what's going on at the time. That's my thought.
So any more discussion of the motion? And the motion again is to place on this evening's agenda an implied motion to repeal our ordinance. All right, I'll call for a vote on that motion. I'll begin with you, Mr. Harding.
Yes.
Ms. Ellsworth.
No.
Mr. Fillmore.
Yes.
Mr. Hoban.
Yes.
Jewell.
Yes.
Mr. Shipley.
Yes.
And I will vote yes. So that is a 6-1 vote with Ms. Ellsworth opposed in favor of putting on the agenda tonight a repeal of our mask ordinance. All right, well, that brings us to the end of the work session today, and a closed session has not been requested, so we will not need a motion to close the meeting. So if there is no objection, we will now adjourn by unanimous consent. All right, thank you all.